December 1945, Upper Egypt. A farmer strikes the earth with his shovel, and the world of early Christianity fractures open. Buried in the soil is a sealed clay jar. Inside it, 13 leather-bound codices, and a gospel no one had seen in nearly 1600 years. A gospel with no narrative, no miracles, no cross, no resurrection story. Only 114 sayings, whispered with the authority of someone who knew Jesus differently than anyone else. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote them down. Why did this text vanish? Why did the church reject it? And who was Thomas, the twin, the disciple who claimed to know a truth powerful enough to reshape the very foundation of Christianity? This is the story of the man Jesus trusted most, and the gospel the world was never meant to read. The history of Christianity cannot be understood without first understanding the world that produced it. The Gospel of Thomas emerged from a specific time and place, a world of political oppression, religious ferment, and profound social upheaval. To comprehend why this text was written, why it was preserved, and ultimately why it was suppressed, we must begin with the landscape of first-century Judea. The Roman Empire had conquered Judea in 63 BCE, when Pompey the Great marched his legions into Jerusalem and desecrated the Holy of Holies in the Temple. By the time Jesus of Nazareth began his ministry around 27 to 30 CE, Rome had been the occupying power for nearly a century. This was not a gentle occupation. Roman governance meant taxation, military presence, public executions, and the constant reminder that the Jewish people lived under foreign domination in their own land. The province of Judea, along with Galilee and other surrounding territories, was administered through a complex system of client kings, prefects, and procurators. At the time of Jesus' ministry, Pontius Pilate served as the Roman prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 CE. Historical records from Josephus and Philo of Alexandria describe Pilate as a brutal administrator who showed little respect for Jewish religious sensibilities. He stationed Roman military standards bearing images of the emperor in Jerusalem, knowing this violated Jewish prohibitions against graven images. He appropriated funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct. These were not the actions of a diplomatic overseer, but of a man who ruled through intimidation and force. The economic reality of Roman occupation was crushing. The Jewish population faced multiple layers of taxation. There was the Roman tributum soli, a land tax, and the tributum capitis, a head tax on all adults. Beyond these imperial taxes, the Jewish people were also obligated to pay the temple tax, tithes to support the priesthood, and various local taxes and tolls. Historians estimate that the cumulative tax burden could reach 40 to 50% of a family's annual income. For subsistence, farmers and day labourers, this meant perpetual debt, land foreclosures, and the constant threat of starvation. Archaeological evidence from Galilean villages of this period reveals a largely agrarian society living at the edge of survival. Excavations at sites like Capernaum and Nazareth show small houses built of fieldstone, typically 1 or 2 rooms, with dirt floors and minimal possessions. The average home measured perhaps 400 to 600 square feet, housing extended families of 6 to 10 people. Cooking was done over open fires, water was carried from communal wells, and sanitation was primitive. This was not the romanticized pastoral landscape often depicted in religious art, but a world of physical hardship, limited resources, and abbreviated lifespans. Within this context of Roman domination and economic pressure, Second Temple Judaism was itself deeply divided. The Jewish religious and political landscape of the first century was not monolithic, but fractured into competing sects, each with different visions for how to respond to Roman occupation and how to interpret Jewish law and tradition. The Sadducees were the priestly aristocracy, the wealthy elite who controlled the temple in Jerusalem and collaborated with Roman authorities to maintain social order. They rejected belief in resurrection, angels and spirits, adhering strictly to the written Torah while dismissing later oral traditions. Their power base was the temple itself, which was not merely a religious institution, but the economic and political center of Judean life. The temple controlled vast wealth, employed thousands of workers, and served as the meeting place between the Jewish leadership and Roman power. The Sadducees had much to lose from social upheaval, and their theology reflected a conservative status quo orientation. The Pharisees represented a more populist movement emphasizing strict adherence to both written and oral Torah. They believed in resurrection and the world to come, and they sought to extend ritual purity laws beyond the temple to everyday life. The Pharisees were not a monolithic group themselves, but included various schools of thought, most notably the stricter school of Shammai and the more lenient school of Hillel. Their influence was primarily in the synagogues rather than the temple, and after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, Pharisaic Judaism would evolve into Rabbinic Judaism, the form that has survived to the present day. The Essenes, known to us primarily through the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, represented an even more radical departure. They withdrew from mainstream Jewish society, viewing the temple priesthood as corrupt and the broader culture as irredeemably compromised. The Essene community at Qumran lived communally, shared property, practiced ritual bathing, and awaited an imminent apocalyptic intervention by God. Their library of texts, hidden in caves near the Dead Sea and discovered between 1947 and 1956, reveals a community obsessed with purity, messianic expectation, and the correct interpretation of Scripture. The Zealots, though not a fully organized movement until the outbreak of the First Jewish-Roman War in 66 CE, represented the impulse toward armed resistance against Rome. Josephus describes various rebel leaders and movements throughout the 1st century, from Judas of Galilee, who led a revolt in 6 CE, to the Sicarii, or dagger men, who assassinated Roman collaborators in crowded marketplaces. The Zealot ideology held that only God was the true king of Israel, and that paying tribute to Caesar constituted idolatry. Into this fractured and volatile landscape came a new generation of teachers, healers, and prophets. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the latter half of the 1st century, mentions several such figures. He describes John the Baptist as a righteous man who called people to ritual purification in the Jordan River. He mentions Jesus of Nazareth, whom he describes in a passage whose authenticity is debated by scholars as a wise man and a doer of startling deeds. He references a figure called Theudas, who promised to part the Jordan River, and an Egyptian prophet who gathered followers on the Mount of Olives, claiming the walls of Jerusalem would fall at his command. This proliferation of prophetic and messianic figures was not coincidental. It reflected the profound crisis facing Jewish society under Roman occupation. When traditional institutions fail to provide meaning, security, or hope, people turn to charismatic leaders who promise radical transformation. The expectation of divine intervention was not abstract theology, but desperate prayer. The apocalyptic literature of this period, including texts like the Book of Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, and portions of the Book of Daniel, imagined a cosmic war in which God would overthrow the oppressors, establish justice, and restore Israel to its rightful place. Literacy rates in 1st century Palestine were extremely low. Recent scholarly estimates suggest that perhaps 3 to 10% of the population could read and write with any facility. Writing was a specialized skill typically confined to scribes, priests, and the educated elite. The vast majority of the population, including Jesus and most of his followers, operated within an oral culture. Knowledge was transmitted through memorization, recitation, and storytelling. When Jesus taught, he spoke in parables, aphorisms, and memorable sayings, precisely because this was the mode of transmission that his audience could carry with them and pass on to others. This oral culture had profound implications for how the Jesus movement began and how it was preserved. The earliest followers of Jesus did not immediately sit down to write gospels. They shared stories, they repeated his sayings, they argued about what he meant. For decades, the traditions about Jesus circulated primarily through word of mouth. When texts began to be written, they were written by a tiny literate minority for communities that would hear them read aloud, not read them silently to themselves. The world that produced the Gospel of Thomas was a world of empire and resistance, of religious diversity and sectarian conflict, of oral tradition and emerging written texts. It was a world where ordinary people struggled to survive under oppressive taxation and military occupation, where the temple stood as a symbol of both divine presence and political compromise, where prophetic voices arose to challenge the status quo and were crushed by Roman crucifixion. It was a world ready for rival interpretations of Jesus, for competing claims about what he taught and what his life and death meant. Understanding this context is essential because the Gospel of Thomas did not emerge in a vacuum. It was one voice among many in the chaotic first centuries of the Christian movement, one interpretation of Jesus among dozens, one community's memory competing with others. The conflicts that would eventually lead to its suppression were already present in the world that gave it birth. The man known as Thomas appears in all four canonical Gospels, but always as a somewhat shadowy figure defined more by a single dramatic moment than by a fully developed personality. Yet the very name by which we know him contains a mystery. Thomas is not a personal name but a descriptive title. In Aramaic, the language Jesus and his earliest followers spoke, Toma means twin. In Greek, the language in which most early Christian texts were written, Didymos also means twin. When the Gospel of John refers to Thomas called Didymos, it is essentially saying twin called twin. This raises an immediate question. Twin of whom? The most straightforward reading would be that Thomas had a biological twin sibling, perhaps someone who did not become part of the Jesus movement and thus was not remembered in the tradition. But some early Christian texts, particularly those from the Syrian tradition, make a more provocative claim, that Thomas was the twin brother of Jesus himself. This tradition appears most explicitly in the Acts of Thomas, a 3rd century text that narrates Thomas's missionary journey to India. In this narrative, Thomas is repeatedly referred to as Judas Thomas and described as Jesus' twin brother. At one point in the story, Jesus appears in the form of Thomas at a wedding, and the bride cannot tell them apart. The text states explicitly, the apostle, the twin of Christ. Modern historical scholarship regards the claim of literal biological twinhood as unhistorical. The canonical Gospels make no mention of Jesus having a twin, and such a significant relationship would likely have been remembered and commented upon. However, the symbolic significance of the twin imagery is profound. To be someone's twin is to be their closest reflection, their double, someone who shares their fundamental nature. In claiming Thomas as Jesus' twin, these traditions were asserting that Thomas understood Jesus more intimately than anyone else, that he alone could represent Jesus' teaching with perfect fidelity. The canonical Gospels provide limited but suggestive details about Thomas's character. In the Gospel of John, Thomas appears in 3 significant scenes, each revealing something about his personality and his relationship with Jesus. The first appearance comes in John 11, when Jesus decides to return to Judea after learning that his friend Lazarus has died. The disciples are alarmed because Jesus had recently faced threats in Judea, and returning seemed dangerous. It is Thomas who speaks up. "Let us also go that we may die with him." This brief statement reveals courage and loyalty, but also a certain fatalism. Thomas does not say, "Let us go and trust that God will protect us," but rather, "Let us go and accept death." There is a stark realism in his words, an unwillingness to indulge in false optimism. The second appearance is at the Last Supper, in John 14. Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to prepare a place for them and that they know the way to where he is going. Thomas interrupts, "Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way?" This is the voice of someone who refuses to pretend he understands when he does not. Where other disciples might nod along, Thomas demands clarity. Jesus responds with one of the most famous lines in the Gospel of John, "I am the way and the truth and the life." The third appearance is the most famous and the one that has defined Thomas's reputation for 2,000 years. After the crucifixion, Jesus appears to the disciples, but Thomas is not present. When the others tell him, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas replies, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." A week later, Jesus appears again, this time with Thomas present. He invites Thomas to touch his wounds, and Thomas responds, "My Lord and my God." Jesus then says, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This story has been interpreted for centuries as a warning against doubt, a cautionary tale about the dangers of demanding empirical proof. Thomas has been labelled Doubting Thomas, the disciple whose faith wavered, whose skepticism needed to be corrected. Generations of Christian preachers have used this story to encourage blind faith and discourage questioning. But modern scholars have begun to read this scene very differently. Thomas was not doubting the resurrection as a general proposition. He was demanding the same evidence that had been granted to the other disciples. Peter, John, and the others had seen Jesus with their own eyes. Thomas simply wanted the same opportunity. His statement, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails," was not unreasonable skepticism but a request for equal access to evidence. Moreover, when Jesus appears to Thomas, he does not rebuke him. He offers exactly what Thomas requested: physical evidence. Jesus validates Thomas's empirical approach even as he pronounces a blessing on those who believe without seeing. The story can be read not as a condemnation of Thomas, but as an acknowledgement that different people come to faith through different paths. Some believe on testimony, others need direct experience. This reading of Thomas as an empiricist, as someone who valued direct knowledge over received authority, becomes crucial when we consider the gospel attributed to him. The Gospel of Thomas is a text obsessed with knowledge, with seeing, with understanding. It begins with the promise, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." It repeatedly emphasizes inner vision and personal discovery. Saying 5 states, "Recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you." If Thomas was indeed characterized by a desire for direct, unmediated access to truth, then a gospel that promises secret knowledge and inner illumination would be an appropriate text to bear his name. But there is another dimension to Thomas that deserves attention: his relationship with doubt itself. In a religious context that increasingly emphasized faith as intellectual assent to propositional truths, Thomas represented something else: the disciple who asked questions, who admitted confusion, who demanded to understand rather than simply obey. The early church fathers were deeply uncomfortable with Thomas. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, interpreted the doubting Thomas story as a divine accommodation to human weakness, suggesting that Jesus appeared to Thomas only because of his lack of faith. Augustine, in the 5th century, argued that Thomas's doubt was actually a grace, because it gave later generations proof of the resurrection. But even in praising the outcome, Augustine reinforced the idea that doubt itself was a problem to be overcome. This discomfort with Thomas's questioning nature becomes even more significant when we consider that he became associated with a whole stream of early Christianity that the emerging Orthodox Church viewed as heretical. Thomasine Christianity, as scholars now call it, emphasized personal gnosis, secret teachings, an inner transformation over external authority and institutional mediation. The question of Thomas's actual historical identity remains elusive. We know he was one of the 12, part of Jesus' inner circle. We know he was remembered for both his loyalty and his questioning nature. Beyond that, the historical Thomas disappears into legend. Syrian Christian tradition claims he travelled to India and founded Christian communities there, eventually suffering martyrdom. The Mar Thomas Syrian Church of India traces its origins to Thomas's mission, and a tomb in Chennai is venerated as his burial place. Whether Thomas actually travelled to India is historically uncertain, but the tradition is not implausible. Trade routes connected the Roman Mediterranean world with India, and there is evidence of Jewish communities in India dating to the 1st century CE. If Thomas did undertake such a journey, it would place him far from the centres of emerging Christian orthodoxy in Jerusalem, Antioch and Rome. This geographical distance might explain how a distinctive Thomasine tradition could develop independently, preserving sayings and teachings that would eventually be suppressed elsewhere. The symbolic meaning of twin extends beyond biography into theology. If Thomas was Jesus' twin, then the teaching becomes clear. Disciples are meant to become twins of Christ, to so fully embody his teaching that they become indistinguishable from him. This is precisely the message of the Gospel of Thomas, that the kingdom of God is not a future event, but a present reality, that the light of the divine is already within each person, waiting to be discovered. In the canonical tradition, Thomas is the doubter, the one who needed correction. In the Thomasine tradition, he is the twin, the one who understood. These competing images of Thomas reflect competing visions of what Christianity should be: a religion of authority and obedience, or a path of questioning and inner transformation. The story of Thomas demanding to see Jesus' wounds has echoed through 2 millennia of Christian preaching, art and devotion. Caravaggio painted it in 1601, showing Thomas's finger literally probing Christ's wounded side. Rembrandt returned to the theme multiple times. The image became iconic: the doubting disciple, the proof demanded, the faith restored. But what actually happened in that room? And what did it mean to the earliest Christians who told and retold this story? The Gospel of John places this encounter 1 week after the resurrection. The disciples were gathered behind locked doors for fear of the Jews, a phrase that reflects John's late 1st century context of conflict between the Jesus movement and the synagogue authorities. Jesus had already appeared to them once before on the evening of the resurrection day itself, showing them his hands and side. Thomas had not been present at that first appearance. When the disciples told Thomas what they had seen, his response was emphatic: "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." The Greek text uses a strong double negative, ou me pisteuzo, which conveys absolute refusal. Thomas was not merely expressing mild skepticism, he was flatly rejecting their testimony. This is striking. Thomas was not dealing with strangers or unreliable witnesses. These were his fellow disciples, people he had travelled with for years, people who had witnessed Jesus' ministry alongside him. If anyone should have been credible witnesses, it was them. Yet Thomas refused to accept their word. Why? One possibility is that Thomas understood, perhaps more clearly than the others, the psychological dynamics of grief and hope. People who desperately want something to be true are capable of convincing themselves they have seen what they wish to see. Mass hallucinations, in the technical psychiatric sense, do not occur, but collective interpretation of ambiguous experiences certainly does. Thomas may have suspected that his friends, traumatized by Jesus' execution and desperate to believe he had not truly died, had experienced something they interpreted as a resurrection appearance, but which was actually something else. Another possibility is that Thomas had a different conception of what resurrection would mean. In Jewish thought of the period, resurrection was not the resuscitation of a corpse, but the transformation of the body into a new, glorified form. Paul's letters, written before the Gospels, describe the resurrection body as pneumatikos, spiritual, as opposed to psychikos, natural. If Thomas believed in resurrection as radical transformation, he might have been skeptical of claims that Jesus appeared with recognizable wound marks. A truly resurrected body, he might have thought, would not bear the scars of crucifixion. A third possibility, which has gained traction among some scholars, is that Thomas's statement was not about doubt at all, but about status and authority. The other disciples had been granted a direct encounter with the risen Jesus. In the social world of the early Jesus movement, this gave them enormous authority. They could claim, "We have seen the Lord," and that seeing conferred on them the right to interpret Jesus' teaching, to lead the community, to make decisions. Thomas's demand to see for himself was a demand for equal authority. He was not willing to accept a subordinate position based on someone else's experience. The text tells us that a week later Jesus appeared again. This time Thomas was present. Jesus spoke directly to Thomas. "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." The text does not explicitly state that Thomas actually touched Jesus. The emphasis is on Jesus' invitation and Thomas's response, "My Lord and my God." This response is theologically significant. Thomas addresses Jesus not merely as teacher or even as Messiah, but as "my God." In the Gospel of John, this represents the climax of the Gospel's high Christology, his understanding of Jesus as divine. The Gospel begins with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And it ends with Thomas's confession of Jesus' divinity. Jesus' response to Thomas has been interpreted in multiple ways. "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Is this a rebuke, a gentle correction, or is it a simple statement of fact, acknowledging that Thomas came to faith through sight while pronouncing a blessing on future generations who would believe on testimony? The traditional interpretation reads this as a rebuke, a suggestion that Thomas's faith was inferior because it required evidence. This interpretation served the needs of the later institutional church, which needed people to accept the authority of scripture and tradition without demanding personal mystical experiences. Doubt was dangerous. Questions undermined authority. True faith meant accepting what the church taught. But another reading is possible. Jesus did not refuse Thomas's request. He did not say, "You should believe without evidence." He provided the evidence Thomas requested. The blessing on those who believe without seeing does not necessarily denigrate those who believe through seeing. It simply acknowledges that direct mystical experience is not available to everyone, and that faith can also arise from testimony and tradition. This alternative reading becomes important when we consider the Gospel of Thomas, where seeing and knowing are central themes. Saying 3 states, "When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." Saying 5, "Recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you." The Gospel attributed to Thomas is obsessed with vision, with knowledge, with direct experiential understanding. If the canonical Thomas was characterized by his demand for empirical evidence, the Thomas of the Gospel of Thomas takes this impulse deeper, arguing that the ultimate proof is not physical sight but in a vision, not touching resurrection wounds, but recognizing the divine light within oneself. The doubting Thomas story served a specific purpose in the Gospel of John and in subsequent Christian tradition. It provided evidence for the resurrection to readers who, like Thomas, had not witnessed it themselves. It affirmed that Jesus' resurrected body was physical enough to be touched, answering early challenges that the resurrection was merely spiritual or metaphorical, and it modelled the journey from doubt to faith, suggesting that questioning was acceptable as long as it ultimately led to belief. But the story also did something else, perhaps unintentionally. It enshrined Thomas as the disciple who asked question, who demanded proof, who refused to accept authority without verification. This made him both useful and dangerous. Useful because his eventual confession validated the resurrection. Dangerous because his questioning spirit could inspire others to question as well. The early church's relationship with Thomas was always ambivalent. He was remembered as one of the 12, someone who had walked with Jesus and witnessed his ministry. But he was also associated with texts and traditions that the emerging Orthodox Church found threatening. The Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, the Book of Thomas the Contender, all these texts from the Thomasine tradition emphasized personal knowledge, secret teachings, and inner transformation in ways that challenged institutional authority. The locked room where Thomas encountered the risen Jesus became a metaphor for the early Christian community, a space of fear and uncertainty, where people gathered to make sense of traumatic events, where claims about Jesus' identity and meaning competed for acceptance. In that room, Thomas represented the voice of skepticism, of empiricism, of the demand for direct experience. His question, "How can we know?" echoes through the centuries as one of the most fundamental human questions. What the canonical tradition did with this question was contain it, channel it, and ultimately subordinate it to faith and authority. Thomas doubted, but then he believed, and his belief was so strong that he declared Jesus to be God. The message was clear. Questions are acceptable as a stage on the journey, but they must lead to the orthodox belief. What the Thomasine tradition did with this question was radicalize it. Instead of seeing doubt as something to be overcome, the Gospel of Thomas suggests that conventional belief itself must be transcended. The goal is not to accept second-hand testimony, but to achieve first-hand knowledge. The kingdom is not something to believe in, but something to discover within yourself. Thomas the doubter becomes Thomas the knower, the twin who mirrors Christ's own consciousness. The moment that defined Thomas, his demand to see, his refusal to believe without evidence, was the moment that made him both a model disciple and a dangerous heretic. The canonical church needed him to authenticate the resurrection, but it also needed to contain the implications of his questioning spirit. The gospel that bears his name suggests that his questions were never fully answered by the Orthodox tradition, that they continued to echo in communities that sought a different understanding of what Jesus taught. The common narrative of Christian origins goes something like this: Jesus died and was resurrected. The disciples received the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. The apostles went forth to spread the gospel. The church was born. This narrative suggests a smooth, unified development from Jesus to the Christian church we know today. The historical reality was radically different. What we call Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries was not one religion, but many, not a unified movement, but a chaos of competing interpretations, rival communities, and contradictory claims about who Jesus was and what he taught. The phrase early Christian diversity understates the situation. Scholars who study this period describe not diversity, but radical pluralism. Not variation within a common framework, but fundamentally incompatible visions of the Jesus movement. To understand this diversity, we need to abandon the idea that there was an original, pure, unified Christianity that later splintered into heresies. Instead, from the very beginning, different people understood Jesus in different ways. The unity and orthodoxy that would eventually emerge was not the original condition, but a later achievement, the result of centuries of conflict, negotiation, and the exercise of power. The earliest written Christian documents we possess are not the Gospels but the letters of Paul written in the 50s CE, roughly 20 to 25 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Paul's letters reveal a movement already fractured by disagreement. In Galatians, Paul describes a sharp conflict with Peter and James over whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law. He writes with fury about rival missionaries whom he calls super-apostles and false brothers. In Corinth, he confronts a community divided into factions, some claiming allegiance to Paul, others to Apollos, others to Peter, others to Christ alone. Paul himself represents one particular interpretation of Jesus, that faith in Christ's death and resurrection brings salvation, that Jewish law is no longer binding on believers, that the Spirit has created a new community transcending ethnic and social divisions. This was a radical departure from how Jesus' earliest followers in Jerusalem, led by his brother James and the disciple Peter, understood the movement. For them, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, his followers were a reform movement within Judaism, and the Torah remained authoritative. This conflict between Pauline and Jerusalem Christianity was not a minor disagreement about details, but a fundamental split about the nature and purpose of the Jesus movement. The Book of Acts, written decades after Paul's letters, tries to minimize this conflict, portraying Paul and the Jerusalem apostles as reaching harmonious agreement at the Jerusalem Council. But Paul's own letters tell a different story, one of ongoing tension and rival missions. Beyond the Pauline and Petrine streams, there were other Christianities. The Gospel of John, written probably in the 90s CE, represents yet another distinct community with its own theological vision. John's emphasis on Jesus as the divine Logos, his realized eschatology, the idea that eternal life is a present reality rather than a future hope, and his distinctive sacramental theology all mark this gospel as emerging from a community with its own unique history and understanding. The Johannine literature also reveals internal conflicts. The letters of John warn against antichrists and false teachers who went out from us, but were not of us. Scholars debate the details, as it appears that the Johannine community experienced a schism, with one group maintaining more docetic beliefs, the idea that Jesus only seemed to have a physical body, and another insisting on the full reality of the Incarnation. Then there was the Ebionite Christianity, known to us primarily through the hostile accounts of later church fathers. The Ebionites were Jewish Christians who continued to observe the Torah, who regarded Jesus as a human prophet adopted by God rather than a divine being, and who rejected Paul as an apostate. They used a version of the Gospel of Matthew edited to remove references to Jesus' divine birth. There was also the Christianity reflected in the Didache, a late 1st century text that provides instructions for baptism, fasting, prayer, and the celebration of the Eucharist. The Didache's vision of Christianity is simple, ethical, and focused on preparation for Jesus' imminent return. It shows little interest in the theological developments that preoccupied Paul or John, and there were the various Gnostic Christianities, known to us from texts like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and many others. These movements understood Jesus as a revealer of saving knowledge, as one who came to awaken humanity from the sleep of ignorance and liberate the divine spark trapped in matter. Gnostic Christians often had radically different cosmologies, ethics, and practices from other Christian groups. The Gospel of Thomas represents yet another stream, the Thomasine Christianity that flourished particularly in Syria. This tradition emphasized Jesus as a wisdom teacher whose sayings, properly understood, could lead to direct knowledge of the divine. Thomasine Christianity was less interested in Jesus' death and resurrection than in his teachings about the kingdom within. These were not minor variations on a common theme. They were radically different religions, all claiming to represent the authentic legacy of Jesus. A Christian from Paul's communities in Corinth or Galatia would have found the Gospel of Thomas baffling. An Ebionite Christian who observed kosher laws would have been horrified by Paul's claim that all foods are clean. A Johannine Christian who believed Jesus was the divine word made flesh would have rejected Ebionite Christology as blasphemous. The geographical distribution of these different Christianities is significant. Paul's mission focused on the urban centres of the Roman Empire: Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Rome itself. The Jerusalem church remained based in Judea until the First Jewish-Roman War forced its relocation. Johannine Christianity may have emerged in Ephesus and the surrounding region. Thomasine Christianity flourished in Syria, particularly around Edessa. Each region developed its own traditions, its own collections of Jesus' sayings, its own practices and theological emphases. Before the late 2nd century, there was no New Testament as we know it. Different communities used different texts. Some used only Paul's letters. Some used one or more of the Gospels that would eventually become canonical. Some used Gospels that would not be canonized, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of the Hebrews. The diversity extended beyond theology to practice. How should baptism be performed? Different communities had different answers. When and how should the Eucharist be celebrated? Different practices prevailed in different regions. What role could women play in leadership? Paul's letters show women serving as deacons and apostles, while later texts like the pastoral epistles forbid women to teach. These were not abstract debates, but lived questions with real consequences for how communities organized themselves. The concept of heresy did not yet exist in the 1st century. There was no authoritative body to define correct belief, no creed to which all Christians subscribed, no agreed-upon scriptural canon. The very idea that there was one true Christianity and various false heresies was a later development, an idea constructed retrospectively to delegitimize certain groups and validate others. This is not to say that early Christians did not argue about truth. They argued constantly. Paul's letters are filled with denunciations of rival teachers. The Gospels contain polemics against other interpreters of Jesus. Early Christian literature is saturated with conflict, but these were conflicts among competing movements, not between orthodoxy and heresy. The question of why certain groups ultimately prevailed while others were marginalized or destroyed is complex. Geography played a role. Communities in major urban centers had more influence than rural movements. Politics mattered. Groups that could navigate relationships with Roman authorities had survival advantages. Numbers were significant. Movements that could attract and retain members grew stronger. Theological flexibility helped. Groups willing to adapt and compromise could build broader coalitions. But perhaps most importantly, institutional development mattered. The movements that eventually formed Orthodox Christianity developed hierarchical structures of authority, systems of episcopal succession, agreed-upon liturgies, and emerging scriptural canons. These institutional developments gave certain forms of Christianity organizational coherence and staying power that more charismatic, loosely organized, or individualistic movements lacked. The Thomasine Christianity that produced the Gospel of Thomas appears to have been less institutionalized than the Pauline and Thomisine streams. It was organized around teachers and wisdom schools rather than bishops and churches. It emphasized individual enlightenment rather than communal participation in sacraments. This may have given it certain advantages in terms of intellectual freedom and spiritual depth, but it also made it vulnerable when the imperial church, backed by state power, set about standardizing Christian belief and practice. By the late 2nd century, figures like Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, were explicitly constructing the category of heresy, drawing boundaries around acceptable belief and using those boundaries to exclude alternative Christianities. Irenaeus' Against Heresies, written around 180 CE, attempted to demonstrate that only 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were authentic, that apostolic succession through bishops guaranteed doctrinal purity, and that various Gnostic and other alternative Christianities were perversions of the true faith. What Irenaeus presented as deviation from an original unity was actually the suppression of original diversity. The heresies he condemned were not corruptions of pure Christianity, but rival claimants to Jesus' legacy, other branches of the movement that had existed from the beginning. The Gospel of Thomas was one casualty of this process. As the institutional church consolidated power, as episcopal authority strengthened, as creeds defined belief, as canon lists excluded non-conforming texts, the Thomasine tradition found itself increasingly marginalized. What had been one voice among many in the first century became, by the 4th century, a forbidden text, a dangerous heresy, something to be destroyed rather than preserved. But before that suppression was complete, Thomasine Christianity had its moment. In certain regions, particularly in Syria, it was not a marginal sect but a mainstream form of Jesus devotion. Communities gathered around the sayings of Jesus as preserved and interpreted in Thomasine tradition. Teachers expounded the secret meanings of the parables. Disciples sought the gnosis, the knowledge that would bring salvation. To those communities, their understanding of Jesus was not heretical, but authentic. They were not distorting the gospel, but preserving it. When they read, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death," they believed they had found the true path. The fact that history would judge otherwise, that the institutional church would suppress their texts and condemn their theology, was not yet imaginable. The explosion of early Christian diversity was not a problem to be solved, but the natural condition of a new religious movement trying to make sense of a profound experience. Different people in different contexts with different needs and backgrounds understood Jesus in different ways. The tragedy is not that this diversity existed, but that it was eventually destroyed, that the richness of early Christian thought was flattened into uniformity, that texts like the Gospel of Thomas were buried for 1600 years. If the Gospel of Thomas represents a distinct stream of early Christianity, then somewhere there must have been communities who preserved these teachings, teachers who expounded them, scribes who copied them, and believers who shaped their lives around them. The evidence for such communities is fragmentary but compelling, pointing particularly to Syria and the city of Edessa as the heartland of Thomasine Christianity. Edessa, located in what is now southeastern Turkey near the Syrian border, was a cosmopolitan city at the crossroads of the Roman and Parthian empires. It was a center of Aramaic culture, the same language Jesus and his earliest followers spoke. This linguistic continuity is significant. While Christianity in the Roman Empire increasingly operated in Greek Syrian Christianity preserved and developed traditions in Aramaic, potentially maintaining closer connection to Jesus' original teachings. The earliest evidence for Christianity in Edessa comes from Eusebius, the 4th century church historian. Eusebius claims that Christianity came to Edessa very early, during Jesus' own lifetime, through correspondence between Jesus and King Abgar of Edessa. This legend is historically implausible. There is no credible evidence that Jesus corresponded with anyone, let alone a foreign monarch. But legends often preserve kernels of historical truth, and Eusebius's claim suggests that Christian tradition in Edessa was extremely ancient enough that the community claimed apostolic origins. The connection between Edessa and Thomas is preserved in multiple texts. The Acts of Thomas, written probably in the early 3rd century in Syriac, describes Thomas's missionary journey from Jerusalem through Mesopotamia to India, with significant action taking place in and around Edessa. While the Acts is largely legendary, filled with miraculous tales and theological dialogues, it reflects the Syrian Christian community's understanding of Thomas as their apostolic founder. More significant is the association of Thomas with the name Judas. The full name given in many Syrian texts is Judas Thomas, or Judas called Thomas. This is striking because Judas was a common Jewish name in the 1st century, and we know of at least 2 other disciples named Judas, Judas Iscariot and Judas son of James. But the Syrian tradition consistently gives Thomas the name Judas, suggesting this was his actual name, with Thomas, twin, being his nickname or descriptive title. The Book of Thomas the Contender, another text found at Nag Hammadi, begins with the phrase, "the secret words that the Saviour spoke to Judas Thomas." This text describes a dialogue between Jesus and Thomas in which Jesus calls Thomas my brother and my twin. The theological emphasis is on self-knowledge as the path to salvation, a theme central to the Gospel of Thomas. Linguistic analysis of the Gospel of Thomas supports a Syrian origin. Although the complete text we possess is in Coptic, scholars have identified underlying Syriac idioms and word patterns in the sayings. Moreover, 3 Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas were discovered at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, dating to around 200 CE. The variations between the Greek and Coptic versions suggest both emerged from an earlier Aramaic or Syriac original. The theology of Thomasine Christianity, as reflected in the Gospel of Thomas and related texts, has distinctive characteristics that set it apart from other early Christian streams. The most prominent is its emphasis on knowledge, gnosis, in Greek, as the means of salvation. This is not intellectual knowledge in the modern sense, but experiential, transformative insight into one's true nature and relationship with the divine. Saying 3 encapsulates this. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. This teaching radically internalizes salvation. The kingdom of God is not a future apocalyptic event, not a place to which one goes after death, but a present reality to be discovered through self-knowledge. The emphasis is on personal realization rather than external authority, on inner transformation rather than adherence to dogma or participation in institutional rituals. Another distinctive feature is the absence of crucifixion and resurrection narratives. The Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel, a collection of logia with no narrative framework. It does not tell the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. This is extraordinary. For Paul, writing in the 50s, the crucifixion and resurrection were the heart of the gospel. For the canonical evangelists, the passion narrative was the climactic focus. But for Thomasine Christianity, apparently Jesus' death and resurrection were not the central salvific events. What mattered were his teachings, his wisdom, his revelation of the path to knowledge. This does not mean Thomasine Christians denied the resurrection. The text begins by referring to the living Jesus, which could imply a post-resurrection context. But the resurrection is not explained, narrated, or emphasized. The focus is entirely on the words Jesus spoke and what they mean. A third distinctive feature is the problematic portrayal of the material world and the body. Several sayings in the Gospel of Thomas express dualistic or world-denying perspectives. Saying 56, "Whoever has come to understand the world has found only a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse is superior to the world." Saying 87, "Wretched is the body that is dependent upon a body, and wretched is the soul that is dependent on these two." This world-denying tendency has led many scholars to categorize Thomasine Christianity as a form of Gnosticism, the diverse set of movements that understood the material world as the creation of a lower deity, the true God as radically transcendent, and salvation as liberation from material existence. However, the relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and Gnosticism is debate. Some sayings in Thomas express world-denying sentiments, but others do not. Saying 113 reports that the disciples asked Jesus when the kingdom would come, and he replied, It will not come by weighing for it. It will not be a matter of saying, here it is, there it is. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it. The community or communities that preserve and transmitted the Gospel of Thomas likely gathered in house churches, as was typical of early Christianity. These would have been small groups, perhaps 20 to 50 people, meeting in the home of a wealthy patron. Unlike the increasingly institutionalized churches developing in major Roman cities, Thomasine communities may have been organized around individual teachers, charismatic figures who claim to possess the keys to interpreting Jesus' secret sayings. The social composition of these communities is difficult to determine. The emphasis on knowledge and interpretation suggests a degree of literacy and education, though in an oral culture, such knowledge could be preserved and transmitted without writing. The economic status of members is unknown, though the text's occasional references to poverty and wealth suggest a socially mixed community. Gender dynamics in Thomasine Christianity are particularly interesting and controversial. The final saying in the Gospel of Thomas records, "Simon Peter said to them, 'Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life.' Jesus said, 'I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.'" This saying is deeply problematic from a modern perspective. It appears to endorse the exclusion of women unless they become male, whatever that might mean. Some scholars interpret this as reflecting ancient gender hierarchies in which maleness represented rationality and spirituality, while femaleness represented materiality and irrationality. Becoming male would then mean transcending material, bodily existence to achieve spiritual perfection. However, this must be balanced against other evidence. The Gospel of Mary, another text from similar circles, portrays Mary Magdalene as Jesus' most faithful disciple, the one who truly understands his teaching, while Peter and the other male disciples remain confused. Saying 1:14 may record an actual conflict within the community between a Petrine faction that wanted to exclude women and a Thomasine or Marian faction that defended women's participation, with Jesus' saying offering a compromise that allowed women's inclusion while framing it in terms acceptable to ancient patriarchal assumptions. The practice of Thomasine communities is largely unknown. The Gospel of Thomas contains no instructions about baptism, Eucharist, or church order. This could mean such practices were considered unimportant, or it could simply reflect the text's genre as a sayings collection rather than a church manual. The Didache, another early Christian text, is a sayings gospel followed by practical instructions about sacraments and community life, suggesting the two types of material were often separate. What we can infer is that Thomasine communities valued meditation on Jesus' sayings, searching for hidden meanings, and teaching that progressed through levels of understanding. The repeated phrase, "whoever has ears to hear should hear," suggests a pedagogical method in which sayings were presented, contemplated, and gradually unpacked under the guidance of a teacher. The relationship between Thomasine Christianity and Judaism is complex. The Gospel of Thomas contains no overt anti-Jewish polemic, unlike much of the New Testament. Many of the sayings draw on Jewish wisdom literature, prophetic traditions, and apocalyptic imagery. Yet there is also a sense of having moved beyond traditional Jewish practices. Saying 14 reports that Jesus' disciples asked him about fasting, prayer, almsgiving, and dietary laws, and Jesus responded with answers that seem to relativize or spiritualize these practices. This suggests a community that understood itself as rooted in Jewish tradition, but no longer bound by conventional Jewish observance. They were not Gentile Christians like Paul's converts, who had never been Jewish, but neither were they Torah-observant Jewish Christians like the Ebionites. They occupied a middle space, drawing on Jewish tradition, while claiming that Jesus' teaching superseded its external forms. The Thomasine community's relationship with other forms of Christianity was apparently conflictual. The reference to Peter demanding Mary's exclusion reflects real tensions, saying 12 records that the disciples asked Jesus who would lead them after he departed, and Jesus replied, "Wherever you are to go to James the Righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." This is remarkable because it explicitly rejects Peter's claim to leadership and instead designates James, Jesus' brother, as the legitimate successor. This saying reflects historical reality. Acts and Paul's letters confirm that James led the Jerusalem church and was recognized as authoritative even by Paul. But by the time the Gospel of Thomas was composed, the Petrine faction had gained ascendancy in many regions, claiming that Peter had been appointed by Jesus to lead the church. Thomasine Christianity's loyalty to James rather than Peter aligned it with the conservative Jewish Christian faction rather than with the increasingly dominant Gentile Christianity. The fate of the Thomasine community or communities is obscure. Syrian Christianity continued to flourish for centuries, but it increasingly aligned itself with orthodox positions articulated at the councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon. The Gospel of Thomas did not disappear immediately. The presence of Greek fragments at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt suggests it was still being copied in the early 3rd century. But by the 4th century, when Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, promulgated his Easter letter listing the books of the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas was explicitly excluded. What happened to believers who continued to revere the Gospel of Thomas? Some may have conformed, accepting the canonical Gospels and abandoning or reinterpreting their Thomasine traditions. Others may have persisted as marginalized communities, meeting secretly, copying their forbidden texts. Eventually, as the imperial church's power to enforce orthodoxy increased, such communities were either converted or destroyed. The community that produced the Nag Hammadi codices, the library that preserved the Gospel of Thomas, was likely a Pachomian monastery in Upper Egypt. The inclusion of the Gospel of Thomas in this collection suggests that even within orthodox monasticism, there were monks interested in alternative traditions, in the wisdom of the earlier, more diverse church. But even they eventually had to hide their books, burying them in the desert to protect them from destruction. The Thomasine community, like Thomas himself, asked questions that the institutional church found threatening. They sought knowledge over obedience, inner transformation over external conformity, direct experience over mediated authority. In a religion increasingly organized around bishops, creeds, and institutional power, such an orientation could not be tolerated. The community vanished, but their text survived, buried in the sand, waiting to speak again. The text itself is where theory meets evidence, where scholarly speculation encounters actual words written on ancient papyrus. The Gospel of Thomas is a collection of 114 sayings, or logia, attributed to Jesus. It has no narrative framework, no birth story, no miracles, no passion account. It begins abruptly. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down. The manuscript that preserves the complete text is Codex II from the Nag Hammadi Library, written in Coptic, the latest stage of the Egyptian language. The codex dates to around 3400 CE, but the text it contains is certainly much older. The question is, how much older? 3 Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas were discovered at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, in excavations conducted by Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt between 1897 and 1903. These fragments, labelled Oxyrhynchus Papyri I, 654 and 655, were published and studied long before the Nag Hammadi discovery. At the time, scholars recognized them as sayings of Jesus, but had no idea they were part of a larger collection called the Gospel of Thomas. Only after 1945, when the Coptic text was discovered, could the fragments be identified as portions of the Gospel of Thomas in Greek. The Oxyrhynchus fragments date to around 200 CE, giving us physical evidence that the Gospel of Thomas was circulating in Egypt by that time. But compositional dates are more difficult to determine. Scholars have proposed dates ranging from as early as 50 CE to as late as 40 CE. The early dating argument points to several factors. Many of the sayings in Thomas have parallels in the canonical Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, but the parallels are not exact. Thomas often preserves shorter, simpler versions of sayings that appear in expanded form in the canonical Gospels. This suggests that Thomas may preserve an earlier, pre-canonical form of the sayings tradition. For example, Thomas saying 9 reads, Jesus said, "Now the sower went out, took a handful of seeds and scattered them. Some fell on the road, the birds came and gathered them up. Others fell on rock, did not take root in the soil and did not produce ears. And others fell on thorns, they choked the seeds and worms ate them. And others fell on the good soil and it produced good fruit. It bore 60 per measure and 120 per measure." Compare this to the version in Mark 4:38, which is longer and includes an allegorical interpretation. Thomas's version is simpler and lacks the interpretation. Many scholars argue that the simpler form is earlier, and that the canonical Gospels expanded and interpreted sayings that originally circulated in the form preserved in Thomas. Moreover, Thomas lacks some of the editorial features that characterize the canonical Gospels. There is no attempt to Christianize Jewish apocalyptic imagery, no effort to present Jesus as fulfilling Old Testament prophecy, no references to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. This could suggest a date of composition before these concerns became central to the Jesus movement. The late dating argument emphasizes that Thomas contains some sayings with clearly Gnostic themes, suggesting composition after the emergence of 2nd century Gnosticism. Additionally, Thomas seems to be aware of and responding to the canonical Gospels, not just drawing on common oral tradition. Some sayings appear to challenge or reinterpret canonical material, suggesting Thomas was composed after those Gospels were written. A middle position, adopted by many scholars, suggests that the Gospel of Thomas contains multiple layers of tradition. The core collection of sayings may date to the 1st century and be independent of the canonical Gospels, drawing on the same oral traditions. But the text underwent editing and expansion in the 2nd century, with the addition of more explicitly Gnostic or mystical material. The relationship between Thomas and the hypothetical Q source is particularly intriguing. Q, short for the German Quell, meaning source, is the name scholars give to a hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings that both Matthew and Luke used as source, in addition to Mark. Q does not survive as an independent document, but scholars have reconstructed it by identifying sayings that appear in both Matthew and Luke but not in Mark. Q, as reconstructed, was primarily a sayings collection, similar in genre to the Gospel of Thomas. It contained little narrative material, focusing instead on Jesus' teachings. The very existence of Q demonstrates that sayings Gospels were an established genre in early Christianity. The Gospel of Thomas is not an anomaly, but an example of a type of text that was common in the 1st century. Some scholars argue for a direct relationship between Thomas and Q, suggesting either that Thomas drew on Q or that both drew on an even earlier common source. Others argue that Thomas and Q represent parallel but independent developments, similar responses to the need to preserve Jesus' teachings in the early decades after his death. The structure of the Gospel of Thomas is deceptively simple. There is no plot, no chronological progression, no narrative development. The sayings appear in no obvious order, jumping from topic to topic, from short aphorisms to extended parables, from easily comprehensible wisdom to utterly cryptic statements. Some scholars argue there is no organizing principle, that the sayings were simply collected as they were remembered or transmitted, with no editorial arrangement. Others detect subtle organizational patterns, catchword connections where one saying leads to another through a shared word or concept, thematic groupings where several sayings address related topics, and rhetorical structures where sayings are arranged to create dramatic or theological effect. For example, the Gospel begins with the saying about discovering the interpretation of these sayings and not tasting death. This functions as a programmatic introduction, telling readers what the text is and what it promises. It ends with the controversial saying about Mary needing to become male to enter the kingdom, which creates a sense of unresolved tension and challenge. The content of the sayings ranges across multiple themes. Some are apocalyptic, warning of coming judgment and the end of the age. Some are wisdom sayings, offering ethical guidance and observations about human behavior. Some are parables, extended metaphors that require interpretation. Some are prophetic pronouncements, declarations about the nature of reality and the divine. Some are autobiographical, with Jesus making claims about his identity and mission. Many sayings have close parallels in the canonical Gospels. Saying 26, "You see the mote in your brother's eye, but you do not see the beam in your own eye," is nearly identical to Matthew 7:3-5. Saying 20, "The parable of the mustard seed," parallels Matthew 13:31-32 and Mark 4:30-32. Saying 54, "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven," echoes Matthew 5:3 and Luke 6:20. But many other sayings have no canonical parallels. Saying 7, "Blessed is the lion which becomes man when consumed by man, and cursed is the man whom the lion consumes, and the lion becomes man," has no equivalent in any other early Christian text. Its meaning remains obscure, though scholars have proposed various interpretations related to mastery of passions, transformation of nature, or Eucharistic symbolism. Saying 77 is particularly remarkable. Jesus said, "It is I who am the light which is above them all. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This saying expresses a cosmic Christology and a panentheistic vision of divine presence in all things. It has no parallel in the canonical tradition. The theological themes that dominate the Gospel of Thomas distinguish it sharply from canonical Christianity. The central theme is the kingdom of God understood not as a future apocalyptic event, but as a present, hidden reality to be discovered through knowledge. Saying 1:13, his disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus said to them, "It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and men do not see it." This realized eschatology contrasts sharply with the synoptic Gospels, where Jesus preaches the imminent coming of the kingdom. In Thomas, the kingdom has already come. The problem is not that it is delayed, but that people fail to perceive it. Related to this is the emphasis on self-knowledge as the path to salvation. Saying 3. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. This gnosis is not intellectual knowledge, but experiential recognition of one's true identity as a child of God. The light that illuminates the world is already within each person, but ignorance obscures it. Salvation comes through awakening to one's divine nature. A third major theme is the problematic relationship between the spiritual and the material. Several sayings denigrate the body, the world, and material existence. Saying 56, "Whoever has come to understand the world has found only a corpse, and whoever has found a corpse is superior to the world." Saying 87, "Wretched is the body that is dependent upon a body." Yet this world denial is not absolute. Other sayings affirm that the kingdom is spread out on the earth, that God's presence pervades all things, that the divine is found in ordinary objects like wood and stone. This tension has led to extensive scholarly debate about whether the Gospel of Thomas is fundamentally Gnostic, proto-Gnostic, or non-Gnostic. A fourth theme is the critique of conventional religious practices and authorities. Saying 14, "If you fast, you will give rise to sin for yourselves, and if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits." This saying challenges traditional Jewish piety, suggesting that external religious observances are not only ineffective but harmful. Saying 39 criticizes the Pharisees. "The Pharisees and the scribes have taken the keys of knowledge and hidden them. They themselves have not entered, nor have they allowed to enter those who wish to." This aligns with critiques found in the canonical Gospels, but the emphasis on keys of knowledge is distinctively Thomasine. A fifth theme is the privileging of hiddenness and secrecy over public proclamation. The Gospel begins by identifying itself as secret sayings. Saying 5 promises that which is hidden from you will become plain to you. Saying 17 declares, "I shall give you what no eye has seen, and what no ear has heard, and what no hand has touched, and what has never occurred to the human mind." This emphasis on secret knowledge, on esoteric teaching available only to those initiated into its mysteries, stands in tension with the canonical tradition's emphasis on public proclamation. In Mark, Jesus teaches openly, and even when he speaks in parables, he later explains them privately to his disciples. In John, Jesus declares, "I have spoken openly to the world, I said nothing in secret." John 18:20. The Gospel of Thomas presents the opposite picture. Jesus' true teaching is secret, cryptic, available only to those who can discover its interpretation. The literary style of the Gospel of Thomas is distinctive. The sayings are introduced with formulaic phrases. Jesus said, he said, they said to him, his disciples said to him. There is no narrative setting, no indication of when or where sayings were spoken. This strips the sayings of context, forcing readers to interpret them without the guidance of a narrative framework. This decontextualization may be deliberate. By removing sayings from specific situations, the text makes them available for multiple interpretations, for application to various circumstances. The sayings become koans, cryptic utterances that resist simple interpretation and demand contemplative engagement. The parabolic language throughout Thomas invites and requires interpretation. Many sayings conclude with "whoever has ears to hear should hear," signalling that the meaning is not immediately obvious. The text assumes readers will not simply consume the sayings passively, but will wrestle with them, discuss them, meditate on them, and gradually discover their hidden significance. This pedagogical method aligns with ancient Mediterranean wisdom traditions, both Jewish and Greek. In Jewish tradition, the rabbis spoke of multiple levels of scriptural interpretation, from the simple literal meaning to increasingly profound mystical significance. In Greek philosophical schools, teachers used enigmatic sayings and paradoxes to provoke students into deeper thinking. The Gospel of Thomas operates within this cultural matrix, presenting Jesus as a wisdom teacher whose sayings contain layers of meaning accessible only through serious intellectual and spiritual work. The question of original language is complex but significant. The complete text we possess is in Coptic, but this is certainly a translation. The Oxyrhynchus fragments prove that a Greek version circulated in Egypt by 200 CE, but is Greek the original language, or was there an earlier Aramaic or Syriac version? Arguments for an Aramaic original include the Syrian provenance of Thomasine Christianity, the Semitic idioms detectable in the sayings, and the fact that Jesus and his earliest followers spoke Aramaic. Arguments for Greek original composition include the sophisticated wordplays that work only in Greek and the text's engagement with Hellenistic philosophical concepts. Most likely, the Gospel of Thomas has a complex textual history. Core sayings may have originated in Aramaic, been collected and transmitted in Syriac in Syria, then translated into Greek for circulation in the wider Roman Empire, and finally translated into Coptic in Egypt. Each translation and transmission involved not just linguistic conversion, but interpretive choices, editorial decisions, and subtle shifts in meaning. The discovery of the Coptic text at Nag Hammadi and the Greek fragments at Oxyrhynchus also reveals something about the circulation and use of the Gospel of Thomas. It was not confined to one community or region, but spread across the Eastern Mediterranean world. Christians in Edessa, Egypt, and possibly elsewhere read, copied, and treasured this text. It was not an obscure document of marginal interest, but a significant text within certain streams of early Christianity. The manuscript evidence also tells us about the text's eventual fate. The Oxyrhynchus fragments are from discarded books found in an ancient garbage heap. This suggests that by 200 CE, some communities were throwing away copies of the Gospel of Thomas, perhaps because it was falling out of favour or being replaced by the canonical Gospels. The Nag Hammadi Codex, buried around 400 CE, represents a different fate, deliberate preservation in the face of persecution. Someone or some community valued this text enough to hide it carefully in hopes that it might someday be recovered. The Gospel of Thomas is a complex, multivalent text that resists simple categorization. It is not simply Gnostic, though it contains themes that would later be developed in Gnostic systems. It is not simply a collection of Jesus' authentic sayings, though it may preserve some words that go back to Jesus himself. It is not simply a mystical text, though it invites contemplative engagement. It is all of these things and more, a window into a form of early Christianity that valued knowledge over faith, inner transformation over external observance, hidden wisdom over public proclamation. It is the written deposit of a community's memory and interpretation of Jesus, a community that eventually lost the struggle for dominance but whose text survived to challenge the victor's narrative. The conflict between Thomas and Peter is not a personal drama documented in historical records, but a theological and political tension embedded in early Christian texts. It represents a fundamental divide in how Jesus' legacy was understood and who had authority to interpret it. This was not a minor disagreement between disciples, but a conflict over the very nature of Christianity itself. The Gospel of Thomas contains a striking saying that directly addresses leadership succession. Saying 12, the disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "Wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." This saying is remarkable for several reasons. First, it explicitly names James, Jesus' brother, as the designated leader, not Peter. This contradicts the Petrine tradition preserved in Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says to Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." The Petrine claim to authority was based on Jesus' direct appointment of Peter as his successor. The Gospel of Thomas presents a competing claim. Jesus appointed James. Historical evidence supports the claim that James actually did lead the early Jerusalem church. Paul's letters, Acts, and the 2nd century historian Hegesippus all confirm that James was recognized as the head of the Jerusalem community. When Paul describes his visit to Jerusalem in Galatians 2, he mentions James first before Peter, suggesting James held primary authority. Acts portrays James presiding over the Jerusalem Council, making the final decision about Gentile observance of Torah. James, as Jesus' brother, had both biological and spiritual authority. In Jewish culture, family ties were paramount, and a brother would naturally be viewed as a legitimate interpreter of a teacher's legacy. But James was also called the righteous, indicating he was respected for his piety and strict observance of Jewish law. The Jerusalem community he led was Torah observant, continuing to worship in the temple and maintain Jewish practices. Peter, by contrast, represented a more flexible approach. According to Acts and Galatians, Peter was willing to eat with Gentiles and didn't insist on circumcision for Gentile converts, though he wavered on this under pressure from the more conservative James faction. Peter's vision on the rooftop in Acts 10, where God declared all foods clean, symbolizes the Petrine movement toward a Christianity that transcended Jewish law. The Gospel of Thomas's preference for James over Peter aligns Thomasine Christianity with the more Jewish, more conservative, more Jerusalem-centered stream of the early movement. But there is an irony here. The Gospel of Thomas itself does not insist on Torah observance. When disciples ask Jesus about fasting, prayer, almsgiving, and dietary laws in saying 14, Jesus' response seems to dismiss or relativize these practices. This suggests a complex relationship where Thomasine Christianity honored James's authority, but interpreted Jesus' teaching in ways that transcended conventional Jewish practice. The tension between Thomas and Peter appears more explicitly in other early Christian texts. The Gospel of Mary, discovered alongside the Gospel of Thomas at Nag Hammadi, contains a dramatic confrontation. After Jesus departs, Mary Magdalene shares a vision she received from Jesus. Peter responds skeptically. Did he really speak with a woman without our knowledge and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Levi, identified with Matthew in some traditions, defends Mary. Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against the woman like the adversaries. For if the Saviour made her worthy, who are you indeed to reject her? Surely the Saviour knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. This conflict is ostensibly about Mary, but it represents a broader tension about authority and revelation. Peter claims authority based on his status as one of the male disciples, part of the official group chosen by Jesus. Mary, Thomas, and their defenders claim authority based on direct revelation, mystical vision, and special knowledge granted by Jesus to those he particularly loved. The Gospel of Thomas contains a saying that seems to reference this same conflict. Saying 114, Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Peter's demand that Mary leave the group reflects a faction within early Christianity that wanted to exclude women from leadership and teaching roles. This exclusion was enshrined in texts like 1 Timothy 2-12. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. The pastoral epistles attributed to Paul, but probably written by later followers, represent the Petrine-Pauline faction's move toward male-dominated institutional authority. Jesus' response in Thomas 114 is ambiguous and troubling. On one level, it appears to endorse gender transformation, suggesting that women must become male to achieve salvation. This reflects ancient assumptions about gender hierarchy, but on another level, Jesus' response can be read as a rebuttal to Peter. Mary will not be excluded. Jesus himself will ensure her transformation into a living spirit. Some scholars interpret becoming male not as literal gender change, but as metaphorical transcendence of earthly categories. In the ancient philosophical imagination, maleness represented rationality, spirituality, and immortality, while femaleness represented materiality, emotion, and mortality. To become male meant to transcend bodily, material existence and achieve spiritual perfection. Read this way, Jesus is not endorsing patriarchy, but using its language to affirm that women can achieve the same spiritual realization as men. The conflict between Thomas, Mary, and Peter reflects different models of religious authority. The Petrine model was institutional, authority derived from apostolic succession, from official appointment, from being part of the recognized leadership structure. This model eventually became dominant in an Orthodox Christianity, with bishops claiming authority through their succession from the apostles, who derived their authority from Jesus' direct commission. The Thomasine model was charismatic and mystical, authority derived from direct revelation, from gnosis, from special insight granted by Jesus to his most beloved disciples. This model privileged personal spiritual experience over institutional position. Anyone who achieved the necessary knowledge could become a teacher, regardless of the official status. These competing models had profound implications for church organization, gender roles, and theological development. The Petrine model naturally led to hierarchy, with clear chains of command, official doctrines, and standardized practices. It enabled Christianity to develop the institutional strength necessary to survive persecution and eventually become the Roman Empire's official religion. The Thomasine model was more anarchic, more individualistic, more resistant to centralized control. It allowed for diversity, for multiple interpretations, for women's leadership, but it also made coordinated action difficult, made doctrinal unity impossible, and left communities vulnerable to fragmentation and eventual suppression by the better organized institutional church. The conflict was not just about personalities or about male versus female leadership. It was about fundamentally different visions of what the Jesus movement should become. Should it be a hierarchical institution with clear authority structures, standardized beliefs, and ordained clergy? Or should it be a loose network of seekers, each pursuing personal enlightenment under the guidance of teachers who claimed direct revelation? History answered this question. The institutional model triumphed. By the 4th century, the Christian church was organized under bishops who claimed unbroken succession from the apostles. Creeds defined correct belief. Councils excommunicated heretics. The Emperor Constantine and his successors gave state power to enforce orthodoxy. But the conflict left traces in the texts. The Gospel of Thomas's defense of James over Peter, its implicit critique of Petrine authority, its affirmation of Mary despite Peter's objections, all these represent the losing side's attempt to preserve its vision. The text itself is an act of resistance, a refusal to accept the Petrine party's claim to exclusive authority. Irenaeus, writing around 180 CE, articulated the Petrine position with precision. He argued that truth could be found only in churches that could trace their leadership back to the apostles, and specifically to Peter and Paul. He claimed that secret teachings, like those found in the Gospel of Thomas, were later inventions by heretics, not authentic apostolic tradition. Only the public teaching transmitted through the institutional church was reliable. This argument was simultaneously historical, claiming that the institutional church preserved the earliest tradition, and political, asserting that only bishops had authority to interpret scripture and define doctrine. It was also, from the perspective of modern historical scholarship, largely false. The diversity of early Christianity was original, not a later corruption. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas represented streams of tradition as ancient as the canonical Gospels. The institutional church's claim to exclusive authenticity was a retrospective construction, not historical fact. But Irenaeus' argument prevailed, not because it was historically accurate, but because the institutional church had the power to enforce it. Books were burned, heretics were excommunicated, alternative communities were dissolved. The memory of earlier diversity was suppressed, rewritten as the story of original unity corrupted by heresy. The conflict between Thomas and Peter was never resolved by argument or consensus. It was resolved by power. The Petrine faction won not because their interpretation of Jesus was more authentic, but because their institutional model proved more durable, more adaptable to the conditions of the Roman Empire, more capable of surviving persecution and ultimately seizing imperial patronage. Thomas, Mary, and their spiritual descendants did not abandon their vision willingly. They were defeated, marginalized, and eventually silenced. The Gospel of Thomas survived not because the institutional church preserved it, but because someone hid it in the Egyptian desert, refusing to let the victors destroy all evidence of the struggle. The transformation of Christianity from a diverse collection of local movements into a unified, institutionalized religion with standardized beliefs and practices was neither inevitable nor quick. It took 3 centuries, required numerous councils and conflicts, and involved the exercise of considerable political power. Understanding this process is essential to understanding why the Gospel of Thomas was eventually suppressed. The earliest Christian communities, as we have seen, were diverse. There was no New Testament, no agreed-upon creed, no unified church structure. Communities in different regions followed different practices, revered different texts, and held different beliefs about Jesus' identity and the meaning of his life and death. This diversity was not viewed as a problem by most early Christians. They understood themselves as part of a movement, not a monolithic institution. Different teachers offered different interpretations, and believers chose which teachers to follow based on personal conviction and local tradition. But diversity created practical problems. When traveling Christians moved between communities, they encountered different practices. Should they adapt to local custom or maintain their own? When teachers from different traditions encountered each other, whose interpretation was correct? When communities split over doctrine or practice, how should the split be resolved? These practical challenges combined with theological concerns to create pressure towards standardization. Some Christian thinkers believed that truth was singular, that there could be only one correct understanding of Jesus' teaching. They viewed theological diversity not as richness, but as confusion, not as freedom, but as chaos. They wanted clarity, certainty, boundaries. The move toward orthodoxy, literally correct belief, began in the 2nd century and accelerated in the 3rd and 4th centuries. It involved several interconnected developments: the formation of the canon, the development of creeds, the establishment of episcopal authority, and eventually the alliance with imperial power. The formation of the New Testament canon was a gradual process. In the mid-2nd century, different communities used different collections of texts. Paul's letters circulated widely and were generally respected, though not all churches used all the same letters. The 4 Gospels that would eventually become canonical, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were widely used, but so were other Gospels like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Hebrews, and the Gospel of Thomas. The first known attempt to create a fixed list of authoritative texts came from an unexpected source. Around 40 CE, a Christian teacher named Marcion proposed a canon consisting of an edited version of Luke's Gospel and 10 of Paul's letters. Marcion rejected the Old Testament entirely, viewing the God of the Old Testament as a different, inferior deity than the God revealed by Jesus. He edited his texts to remove all positive references to the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish God. Marcion's proposal was controversial and was eventually rejected, but it forced other Christian leaders to articulate their own positions about which texts were authoritative. If Marcion's limited canon was wrong, what was the right canon? The earliest surviving list of canonical texts comes from the Muratorian fragment, dated to around 20 CE. This fragmentary Latin text lists most of the books that would eventually become the New Testament, including the 4 Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, and some other epistles. It explicitly rejects certain texts, including a Gospel of Peter, and texts attributed to Gnostic teachers. Significantly, it provides reasoning for its choices. Books should be attributed to apostles or their close associates, should reflect widespread usage in multiple churches, and should conform to orthodox teaching about Jesus. This last criterion is circular. Texts that conform to orthodox teaching are declared canonical, and canonical texts define orthodox teaching. But the circularity was effective. By the end of the 2nd century, a core set of texts, the 4 Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters, were widely recognized as authoritative, while other texts were increasingly marginalized. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, issued his Easter letter in 300 CE listing the 27 books of the New Testament as we know it today. This list was not immediately universal. Some churches continued to dispute certain books for centuries, but it represented a broad consensus among the major episcopal sees. The Gospel of Thomas was not included. By the 4th century, it was explicitly classified as heretical. Church fathers like Hippolytus, Origen, and Eusebius mentioned it disapprovingly, associating it with Gnostic teachers and condemning its secret teachings as innovations rather than authentic apostolic tradition. Parallel to canon formation was the development of creeds. Creeds are succinct statements of belief designed to distinguish orthodoxy from heresy. The earliest creedal formulas were simple, like the confession Jesus is Lord found in Paul's letters. But as theological controversies became more complex, creeds became more elaborate. The Apostles' Creed, which developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, includes affirmations about God the Father, Jesus Christ, including his birth, crucifixion, resurrection and ascension, the Holy Spirit, the Church, and the resurrection of the dead. Notably, it emphasizes Jesus' physical birth, death, and resurrection, implicitly rejecting Docetic and Gnostic teachings that denied Jesus' full humanity or the importance of his physical resurrection. The Nicene Creed, formulated at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and revised at Constantinople in 381 CE, addresses the more sophisticated theological debates of the 4th century, particularly the question of Jesus' relationship to God the Father. It affirms that Jesus is begotten, not made, of one being with the Father, rejecting Arian teaching that Jesus was a created being rather than fully divine. Creeds functioned as boundaries. To be Christian meant affirming the creed. Those who refused were heretics, excluded from the community. Baptism became linked to creedal affirmation. Converts had to assent to orthodox belief before being baptized. The Gospel of Thomas contains no affirmation of Jesus' virgin birth, no emphasis on his crucifixion and physical resurrection, no Trinitarian theology. It emphasizes personal knowledge over creedal belief, inner transformation over doctrinal conformity. A Christianity defined by the Gospel of Thomas would be unrecognizable to a Christianity defined by the Nicene Creed. The third major development was the consolidation of episcopal authority. In the earliest Christian communities, leadership was diverse. Paul's letters mention apostles, prophets, teachers, deacons, and overseers, bishops. These roles were not clearly hierarchical, and different communities had different structures. By the early 2nd century, a pattern was emerging in which each community had a single bishop who held primary authority, assisted by presbyters, elders, and deacons. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 CE, argued passionately for this monarchical episcopate, claiming that unity required submission to the bishop. Without the bishop, he argued, there could be no valid Eucharist, no legitimate baptism, no church. This hierarchical model had practical advantages. It provided clear leadership, enabled coordinated response to persecution, and allowed churches to communicate and cooperate across regions. but it also concentrated power in the hands of a small male elite and marginalized charismatic and prophetic forms of leadership, including women's leadership. By the late 2nd century, bishops were claiming apostolic succession, the idea that they were legitimate successors to the apostles, inheriting their authority through an unbroken chain of ordinations. Irenaeus argued that bishops could trace their lineage back to the apostles, and this succession guaranteed the authenticity of their teaching. Churches that could not demonstrate apostolic succession had no claim to authority. This argument served to exclude alternative Christianities. Thomasine communities, organized around teachers rather than bishops, had no comparable institutional structure. They could not claim apostolic succession in the institutional sense. Their claim to authority, direct revelation, mystical gnosis, was precisely what the Episcopal Church rejected as unreliable and dangerous. The fourth development, which consolidated all the others, was the alliance with imperial power. For its first 3 centuries, Christianity was generally illegal in the Roman Empire and periodically persecuted. Persecution was sporadic and inconsistent, more severe in some regions and periods than others, but always a threat. Christians faced the possibility of arrest, torture, and execution for their refusal to worship the Roman gods and honour the emperor as divine. Everything changed when Constantine became emperor. In 312 CE, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine claimed to have a vision promising victory if he fought under the sign of Christ. After his victory, Constantine converted to Christianity and began favouring the church with legal protection, financial support and political patronage. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance to Christians. Constantine funded the construction of churches, exempted clergy from taxes, and mediated theological disputes. Most dramatically, he convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, gathering bishops from across the empire to resolve the Arian controversy and establish doctrinal unity. Constantine's patronage transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into a privileged faith, and eventually, by the end of the 4th century under Theodosius III, the official religion of the Roman Empire. This brought enormous benefits. Churches were built, Christians could worship publicly without fear, clergy received state support. But imperial patronage came with costs. The emperor expected the church to provide ideological unity for the empire. Theological diversity, which had been an internal Christian issue, became a threat to imperial stability. The emperor had the power and the motivation to enforce orthodoxy. Heresy was no longer merely wrong belief but political subversion. Under Christian emperors, heresy became a crime punishable by imperial law. Books were confiscated and burned. Heretical teachers were exiled. Churches belonging to non-orthodox groups were seized and given to orthodox bishops. The machinery of state power, which had persecuted Christians, now persecuted non-orthodox Christians. The Gospel of Thomas became a target in this environment. It represented precisely the kind of Christianity that the imperial church sought to eliminate. Texts claiming secret authority, teachings emphasizing personal gnosis over institutional mediation, communities organized outside episcopal control. Possession of such texts became dangerous. Copying them became illegal. They had to be destroyed or hidden. The rise of orthodoxy was not simply an intellectual process of determining correct doctrine. It was a political process of consolidating power, marginalizing alternatives, and constructing a history that portrayed diversity as corruption and uniformity as original purity. The institutional church claimed it was preserving the authentic apostolic tradition against later heresies. Modern scholarship reveals the opposite. The church was creating uniformity out of original diversity, imposing a single vision where many had existed, silencing voices that had spoken from the beginning. The Gospel of Thomas was not a later Gnostic deviation from pure Christianity. It was one of Christianity's original voices, as old as or older than the canonical Gospels, representing communities as ancient as those in Rome or Antioch. Its suppression was not the triumph of truth over error, but the victory of one form of Christianity over others, through the exercise of institutional and imperial power. The suppression of the Gospel of Thomas was not an accident of history, not a random loss of an ancient text. It was a deliberate act of erasure, the result of conscious decisions by church authorities to eliminate a text they viewed as dangerous. Understanding why the text was suppressed requires examining the specific theological and political threats it posed to the emerging Orthodox Church. The most fundamental threat was theological. The Gospel of Thomas presented a vision of salvation dramatically different from the one that became orthodox. In canonical Christianity, salvation came through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. Paul's letters, the earliest Christian documents, emphasize that Jesus died for our sins and was raised for our justification. The crucifixion and resurrection are the central salvific events. Believers are saved by faith in what Jesus did, not by what they know or achieve. The Gospel of Thomas barely mentions Jesus' death and says nothing about its salvific significance. There is no passion narrative, no emphasis on atonement, no suggestion that Jesus' death accomplished anything for believers. Instead, salvation comes through discovering the hidden meaning of Jesus' sayings. Saying 1, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. This is salvation through knowledge, not faith. It is achieved through personal insight, not through Jesus' sacrifice. The locus of salvation is not a historical event, the crucifixion and resurrection, but an inner realization. This fundamental difference threatened the entire structure of Orthodox soteriology. If salvation comes through discovering hidden meanings in Jesus' sayings, then the crucifixion is not central. The entire apparatus of atonement theology, Christ as sacrificial lamb, blood cleansing sin, death defeating death, becomes irrelevant. The Church's claim that Jesus' death was necessary for salvation collapses. This was unacceptable to Orthodox theologians who had built their entire understanding of Christianity around the cross. The second major threat was ecclesiological. The Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on personal gnosis undermines the need for institutional mediation. If the kingdom is already present, spread out on the earth but unseen, if each person can discover it through inner vision, then what role does the Church play? Orthodox Christianity developed a sacramental system in which salvation was mediated through the Church. Baptism initiated believers into the community. The Eucharist conveyed grace. Penance absolved sin. Clergy administered these sacraments, and bishops controlled the clergy. The institutional church positioned itself as the necessary mediator between God and humanity. The Gospel of Thomas suggests no such thing. There are no sacraments in Thomas, no baptism, no Eucharist, no liturgy. The emphasis is entirely on personal understanding. Saying 3 states that the kingdom is inside you and outside you, and when you know yourself, you will realize you are children of the living Father. This is direct access to God without institutional mediation. If believers could achieve salvation through personal gnosis, without participating in church sacraments, the institution's power evaporated. Why submit to bishops if they have no unique access to salvific truth? Why participate in liturgy if salvation is an inner realization? Why remain in a community if enlightenment is an individual achievement? The Church Fathers recognized this threat immediately. Irenaeus, writing in Against Heresies around 180 CE, repeatedly emphasized that salvation comes only through the Church, that truth is preserved only in churches with apostolic succession, that secret teachings allegedly from Jesus are actually later innovations. His arguments were directed precisely against the kind of Christianity represented by the Gospel of Thomas. The third threat was hermeneutical. The Gospel of Thomas teaches that Jesus' sayings have hidden meanings requiring interpretation. Saying 2, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over all." The process of seeking, finding, being troubled, and being astonished describes a hermeneutical journey in which meaning is not immediately obvious, but must be discovered through contemplation. This approach to interpretation is radically subjective. If sayings have secret meanings, and different teachers propose different interpretations, how is truth determined? Who decides which interpretation is correct? The Gospel of Thomas provides no answer beyond personal realization. The interpretation is correct when the seeker finds it and experiences the existential transformation it promises. Orthodox Christianity needed a more objective hermeneutic. The solution was to vest interpretive authority in the episcopacy. Bishops, through apostolic succession, inherited the apostles' authority to interpret Scripture. Individual believers could read Scripture, but the Church determined its meaning. This preserved institutional control over interpretation and prevented the proliferation of rival readings. The Gospel of Thomas's model of interpretation, by contrast, was essentially democratic or anarchic, depending on perspective. Any sufficiently wise teacher could claim to possess the keys to interpretation. Any serious seeker could discover meanings independently. This threatened the episcopal monopoly on truth. The fourth threat was social and political. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 1:14, despite its problematic gender language, appears to defend women's participation in the community against Peter's objection. The broader Thomasine tradition, as evidenced in texts like the Gospel of Mary, portrayed women as recipients of revelation and legitimate teachers. The institutional church, as it developed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, increasingly restricted women's roles. The pastoral epistles forbade women to teach or have authority over men. Church orders like the Didascalia Apostolorum excluded women from liturgical leadership. The theological justification was that Jesus chose only male apostles, and only their male successors could exercise authority. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary contradicted this narrative. They showed Jesus teaching women, granting them revelation, defending them against male disciples who wanted to exclude them. If these texts were accepted as authentic, the basis for excluding women from church leadership collapsed. Beyond gender, the Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on poverty and its critique of wealth threatened the increasingly wealthy church. Several sayings condemn attachment to possessions. Saying 63 tells a parable of a rich man who dies before enjoying his wealth, concluding, "Whoever has ears to hear should hear." Saying 110, "Whoever finds the world and becomes rich, let him renounce the world." By the 4th century, the church was accumulating substantial wealth. Bishops lived in palaces. Churches were adorned with gold and silver. The clergy were exempt from taxes. This was a far cry from Jesus' teaching about selling possessions and giving to the poor. The Gospel of Thomas's uncompromising stance on wealth and materialism was an uncomfortable reminder of a simpler, more radical ethos. The fifth threat was eschatological. Orthodox Christianity, especially after the apocalyptic expectations of the 1st century failed to materialize, developed a future-oriented eschatology. Jesus would return at the end of time. The dead would be resurrected. God would judge the world. Believers would receive eternal life in a transformed creation. This future hope provided comfort and motivation for endurance under persecution. The Gospel of Thomas's realized eschatology undermined this hope. Saying 51 reports that disciples asked when the rest for the dead would come and when the new world would arrive. Jesus replied, What you look for has come, but you do not recognize it. The kingdom has already come. There is no need to wait for a future transformation. The new world is already here. The problem is blindness, not delay. This was potentially devastating to church morale. If the kingdom has already come, why are believers still suffering? If the new world is already here, why does everything seem so broken? The Orthodox future hope provided an explanation. We suffer now, but will be rewarded later. The Gospel of Thomas's realized eschatology offered no such comfort. It demanded recognition of present reality, not consolation through future promise. The sixth and perhaps most fundamental threat was authority itself. The Gospel of Thomas begins by identifying itself as secret sayings. Irenaeus and other church fathers repeatedly attacked the concept of secret teaching. They argued that Jesus taught openly, that his teaching was public, that the apostles transmitted it transparently. Secret teachings, they claimed, were later inventions by heretics designed to deceive the gullible. This argument served an obvious purpose. It denied legitimacy to any text or teaching not approved by the institutional church. If Jesus taught nothing in secret, then the Gospel of Thomas's claim to preserve his secret sayings is false. If the apostles transmitted everything publicly through the institutional church, then alternative traditions claiming secret apostolic origins are lies. But the argument is historically dubious. Even the canonical Gospels preserve the idea that Jesus taught some things privately to his inner circle. Mark 4:11 reports Jesus telling his disciples, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside everything is in parables." Matthew, Luke, and John all contain instances of private teaching to the disciples. The real issue was not whether Jesus taught secretly. He clearly did, according to the canonical tradition itself, but who controlled access to those secret teachings? The institutional church claimed that secrets were entrusted to the apostles who transmitted them through apostolic succession to bishops. Alternative groups like the Thomasine communities claimed that secrets were preserved in their texts and available to anyone who could interpret them properly. The stakes were absolute. Either the institutional church had exclusive authority over Christian truth, or it did not. If alternative texts and traditions were legitimate, if different communities could claim apostolic authority, if individuals could discover truth through personal gnosis, then the church's claim to be the sole guardian of revelation was false. The suppression of the Gospel of Thomas must be understood in this context. It was not merely one text among many that happened not to be canonized. It was a direct threat to the institutional church's fundamental claims about salvation, authority, interpretation, and social order. Practical implementation of suppression varied. In regions where bishops had strong authority, they could simply forbid the text's use. Lists of approved and forbidden books guided clergy and literate believers. Public book burnings destroyed copies. Legal penalties attached to possession of heretical texts. But suppression was never total. Egypt, with its vast desert and numerous monasteries, provided opportunities for preservation. The Nag Hammadi codices, including the Gospel of Thomas, were carefully copied, bound in leather, and placed in a sealed jar. Someone valued these texts enough to save them, even knowing that possession was dangerous. The suppression of the Gospel of Thomas was not the inevitable outcome of objective assessment of its historical reliability or theological merit. It was the result of power dynamics within early Christianity. The faction that controlled the major urban episcopates, that developed hierarchical structures, that allied with imperial power, that created creeds and canons, that faction won. The Gospel of Thomas represented the losing side. Had history gone differently? Had Thomasine Christianity developed stronger institutional structures? Had different texts been canonized? Christianity today might emphasize personal knowledge over institutional faith, inner transformation over sacramental participation, direct revelation over episcopal authority. But history did not go differently. The institutional church triumphed, and the Gospel of Thomas was buried in the sand. The physical disappearance of the Gospel of Thomas from the historical record is as significant as the theological reasons for its suppression. A text can be condemned by church authorities, but unless physical copies are systematically destroyed, the text survives. The fact that the Gospel of Thomas vanished so completely for 16 centuries requires explanation. Manuscript culture in the ancient world operated very differently from print culture or digital culture. There was no printing press, no mass production, no centralized distribution. Each copy of a text had to be produced individually by hand. A scribe would carefully copy an existing manuscript letter by letter, word by word. This was slow, expensive, labor-intensive work. For a text to survive and spread, it needed multiple things: communities that valued it enough to commission copies, scribes skilled enough to produce them, patrons wealthy enough to fund the work, and readers interested enough to preserve the results. If any of these conditions failed, the text could vanish. In the case of the Gospel of Thomas, all these conditions eventually failed. As Thomasine Christianity was marginalized by the institutional church, communities that valued the text declined in number and influence. Bishops forbade its copying. Scribes refused to work on heretical materials. Patrons who funded heretical texts risked persecution, and possession of the text became dangerous. The process was gradual. The Gospel of Thomas did not disappear overnight. The Greek fragments from Oxyrhynchus demonstrate that copies were still circulating in Egypt in the early 3rd century. References by church fathers indicate that some copies existed in the 4th century, but by the 5th century, the text had effectively vanished from circulation. Several mechanisms contributed to this disappearance. The first was official prohibition. As the institutional church consolidated power, especially after alliance with the Roman state in the 4th century, bishops could enforce their authority. Lists of canonical and heretical books guided the faithful. Books on the heretical list were not to be read, copied, or possessed. Athanasius's Easter letter of 367 CE is particularly significant. Written to churches under his jurisdiction as Bishop of Alexandria, it listed the 27 books of the New Testament and explicitly forbade the reading of apocryphal books, calling them inventions of heretics. Athanasius had the authority to enforce this directive, and Egypt was his jurisdiction. Possession of forbidden texts could result in excommunication or worse. The second mechanism was the control of scriptoria. In the ancient world, most book production happened in institutional settings: monastic scriptoria, episcopal libraries, philosophical schools. Individual Christians rarely possessed the skills, materials, or resources to produce manuscripts. They depended on institutional production. Once the institutional church controlled the major scriptoria and decided which texts would be copied, the fate of non-canonical texts was sealed. Scribes were instructed to copy the canonical Gospels, Paul's letters, and other approved texts. They were forbidden to copy heretical materials. A scribe who defied this instruction risked his livelihood and his standing in the community. The third mechanism was the expense and fragility of manuscripts. Ancient books were written on papyrus or parchment, both expensive materials. Papyrus, made from Egyptian reeds, was cheaper but less durable. It deteriorated quickly in humid conditions, though it could last centuries in the dry Egyptian climate. Parchment, made from treated animal skins, was more durable but extraordinarily expensive. A single large codex might require the skins of several hundred animals. Because manuscripts were expensive, they were not produced in large quantities. A popular text might exist in dozens or hundreds of copies across the empire. A less popular or controversial text might exist in only a handful of copies. If those few copies were destroyed or simply deteriorated without being replaced, the text was lost forever. The fourth mechanism was the decline and disappearance of communities that preserved alternative texts. Thomasine Christianity as a distinct movement does not survive past the 4th or 5th century. Its communities were either converted to orthodoxy, absorbed into other groups, or simply died out. When the communities disappeared, so did the texts they valued. This pattern repeated across the ancient world. Countless texts from antiquity have been lost, not because of deliberate suppression, but because no one continued to value them enough to make new copies. The Gospel of Thomas was unusual in that its loss was both accidental, the general pattern of manuscript loss, and deliberate, active suppression by church authorities. The fifth mechanism was the transition from scroll to codex. In the early centuries CE, books were typically written on scrolls, long sheets of papyrus or parchment rolled around wooden cores. The codex, the format we recognize as a book with pages bound together, gradually replaced the scroll between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Christians were early adopters of the codex format, perhaps because it made texts easier to reference and compare. But the transition created an opportunity for selection. When texts were copied from scroll to codex, decisions had to be made about which texts were worth the effort and expense. Canonical texts were prioritized. Non-canonical texts were often left in scroll format and eventually deteriorated. The sixth mechanism was the destruction of heretical materials. This was not merely passive neglect, but active persecution. Imperial laws from the 4th and 5th centuries mandated the destruction of heretical books. Theodosius I's edict of 381 CE condemned various heresies and ordered their books burned. Subsequent emperors issued similar edicts. We have records of public book burnings in major cities. In some cases, bishops organized raids on heretical communities, confiscating and destroying their libraries. The systematic nature of this destruction is one reason why so many alternative Christian texts were lost. Yet destruction was never total. Egypt, with its vast desert and numerous monasteries and complex religious landscape, provided spaces where forbidden texts could survive. The desert itself became a kind of archive. The dry climate preserved papyrus that would have deteriorated elsewhere. Monasteries on the edge of the desert sometimes accumulated libraries that included texts from earlier, more diverse periods of Christianity. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1845, appears to have been just such a collection. It contained 13 codices with 52 texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, and many other texts condemned by Orthodox authorities. The codices were produced in the mid-4th century, precisely the period when Athanasius was circulating his list of canonical books and forbidding heretical ones. Someone, or some group, gathered these texts, carefully copied them into codices, bound them in leather, and sealed them in a large jar. This was not an accidental collection, but a deliberate library. The texts were not randomly abandoned but carefully preserved. The question is, by whom and why? The most likely scenario is that the codices belonged to a Pachomian monastery in the region. Pachomius had founded the first Christian Cenobitic monasteries in Upper Egypt in the early 4th century. By mid-century there were multiple Pachomian monasteries in the area where the Nag Hammadi codices were found. Monasteries were complex institutions. Though they submitted to episcopal authority, they also maintained a degree of autonomy. Monks copied texts, accumulated libraries, and engaged in theological study. A monastery's library might include not only orthodox texts, but also older materials from earlier periods, including texts that were no longer officially acceptable. As pressure increased to conform to the canonical list, as bishops like Athanasius exercised more control, monks faced a dilemma. They had texts their community had valued for generations, texts that contained teachings they believed authentic, but possession of these texts was now forbidden, even dangerous. What should they do? Some monks undoubtedly complied, destroying their heretical materials. Others resisted, hiding their books in hopes that someday the persecution would pass and the texts could be recovered. The Nag Hammadi codices represent such an act of preservation. Someone cared enough about these texts to save them from destruction, even if that meant burying them in the desert and possibly never recovering them. The location of the burial is significant. The jar was found near Jabal al-Tarif, a cliff containing caves that had been used as burial sites for centuries. This was not a random spot, but a known location, a place where things were deliberately placed for preservation. The person or persons who buried the codices chose this location because it was safe, because the dry caves would protect the papyrus, because it was the kind of place where something buried might survive for centuries. For 1600 years the jar remained sealed. The Gospel of Thomas lay in darkness, its words silenced, his vision of Christianity forgotten. The institutional church triumphed. Orthodoxy became not just one interpretation of Christianity, but the only interpretation that most people knew existed. The memory of alternative Christianities faded into legend, distorted beyond recognition in the polemics of heresiologists. The disappearance of the Gospel of Thomas was not simply a loss of one ancient text. It was the erasure of an entire way of understanding Jesus and his message. It represented the silencing of communities who believed that the kingdom was already present, that salvation came through knowledge rather than faith, that direct experience of the divine was more important than institutional mediation. When the text disappeared, so did the memory that Christianity had ever been anything other than what the Orthodox Church claimed it was. The irony is that the very act of suppression preserved the text. If the Gospel of Thomas had simply fallen out of use naturally, if communities had stopped valuing it without persecution, the text would likely have vanished completely. No one would have bothered to hide it. But because it was actively suppressed, because possession was dangerous, someone cared enough to preserve it in the only way possible, by burying it and hoping for future discovery. The disappearance of the Gospel of Thomas was replicated across the ancient world with countless other texts. We know of their existence only through references in other works, through fragments quoted by opponents, through catalogue lists. The Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, all these texts are known to have existed, but all have been lost except for brief quotations. Some texts were luckier. The Gospel of Peter survived in a single incomplete copy discovered in Egypt in 1886. The Didache, unknown for centuries, was discovered in a monastery in Constantinople in 1873. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in Tarston, revealed Jewish texts that had been hidden in caves near the Dead Sea for 2,000 years. Each discovery reminded scholars how much had been lost, and how accidental our knowledge of the ancient world really is. The Gospel of Thomas might easily have remained lost forever. If the farmer who discovered the jar had not struck it with his shovel, if he had decided the jar was worthless and left it buried, if the codices had been destroyed in the various adventures that followed their discovery, the text would still be known only through brief hostile references in church fathers. We would know that a Gospel of Thomas once existed, that it contained sayings of Jesus, and that church authorities condemned it. But we would have no idea what it actually said. The physical disappearance of texts is one of the great tragedies of history. Every lost book represents not just words on papyrus, but human thought, experience, and creativity that can never be recovered. The ancient world produced millions of books: history, philosophy, poetry, drama, science, religion. The vast majority are gone forever. We possess only a tiny fraction, and even that fraction is skewed towards texts that powerful institutions chose to preserve. In the case of early Christian literature, the skew is extreme. We possess abundant copies of the canonical Gospels, Paul's letters, and other New Testament texts because churches valued them and copied them repeatedly for 2,000 years. We possess almost nothing of alternative Christian literature because it was actively suppressed. The history we know is the history the victors chose to preserve. The disappearance of the Gospel of Thomas matters not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder of how contingent our knowledge is. What we know about early Christianity depends entirely on which texts survived. If different texts had been preserved, if the Nag Hammadi library had been discovered, but the canonical Gospels had been lost, we would have a completely different understanding of Christian origins. We would know about Jesus as a teacher of secret wisdom. We would know about conflicts between Peter and Mary. We would know about forms of Christianity that emphasize knowledge over faith. And we would have no idea that anyone had ever believed Jesus died for our sins or was physically resurrected. This is not merely hypothetical. In many cases, our understanding of ancient movements depends on single surviving sources. If that source is biased or incomplete, our understanding is distorted. The Gospel of Thomas provides a corrective to the canonical narrative precisely because it offers an independent perspective, a view from a different stream of the early Christian movement. The disappearance also raises ethical questions about preservation and power. Who decides which texts survive? In the ancient world, the answer was clear. Institutional authorities decided. Bishops controlled scriptoria and determined which texts would be copied. Emperors issued laws about which books could be possessed. The wealthy and powerful funded the production of manuscripts that reflected their interests and values. The result was that perspectives from the margins, women's voices, dissenting communities, alternative theologies, were systematically excluded. The history that survived was the history of power, told by those who controlled the means of cultural production. The Gospel of Thomas survived only because someone defied that power, someone who chose preservation over obedience, who risked punishment to save a text they believed contained truth. In the broader scope of human history, countless voices have been similarly silenced. Indigenous traditions suppressed by the colonizers, women's writings excluded from canons, minority perspectives erased by dominant cultures. The pattern repeats endlessly. The Gospel of Thomas is one small example of a universal phenomenon. The use of power to control memory, to shape narratives, to determine what future generations will know about the past. The text's disappearance lasted 16 centuries. That is an almost incomprehensible span of time. The Roman Empire rose and fell. Christianity spread across the globe. The Middle Ages came and went. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the modern era, all these historical periods passed while the Gospel of Thomas lay buried in the Egyptian desert. During those centuries, countless people struggled with questions about faith, authority, and religious experience. How many would have found resonance in the Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on inner knowledge? How many would have been strengthened by its message that the kingdom is already present? How many might have built different forms of spiritual community based on its vision of personal transformation rather than institutional mediation? We will never know. Those 16 centuries of silence cannot be recovered. The conversations that might have happened, the communities that might have formed, the individuals who might have found spiritual homes in Thomasine Christianity, all of that is lost forever. The disappearance of the text represented not just the loss of words on papyrus, but the foreclosing of possibilities, the narrowing of what Christianity could be. When the jar was finally opened in 1945, the Gospel of Thomas spoke again, but it spoke into a very different world than the one it had left. The institutional church that suppressed it still existed, but it no longer had the power to enforce its will through state violence. Scholarship had developed historical methods for studying ancient texts critically. The printing press meant that once rediscovered, the text could be disseminated widely and quickly. The Gospel of Thomas could not be suppressed again. Yet the 16 centuries of silence left their mark. Christianity had developed without the Gospel of Thomas's influence. Theological traditions, institutional structures, devotional practices, all had been shaped by the canonical texts and the orthodox tradition they represented. The Gospel of Thomas was now a curiosity, an ancient artifact, an object of scholarly study. It could not simply step back into active use as a living scriptural text. Too much had happened in its absence. The disappearance of the Gospel of Thomas was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions by specific people exercising institutional power. Bishops chose to condemn it, emperors chose to ban it, scribes chose not to copy it. Communities chose to hide it rather than lose it entirely. Each of these choices shaped the history of Christianity and the history of Western culture more broadly. If those choices had been different, if the Gospel of Thomas had remained in circulation, alongside the canonical Gospels, Christianity would have developed differently. There would have been ongoing tension between knowledge-based and faith-based approaches to salvation, between mystical and institutional forms of authority, between inner transformation and sacramental participation. That tension would have been creative and generative, producing a richer, more diverse Christian tradition. Instead, one vision triumphed and the other disappeared. The institutional church achieved the unity it sought, but at the cost of suppressing alternatives. The Gospel of Thomas vanished, taking with it a form of Christianity that might have offered different answers to human spiritual needs, different ways of understanding divine-human relationship, different models of religious community. The text's disappearance stands as a monument to the power of institutions to shape memory and control narratives. It reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what was remembered, recorded, and preserved. And it challenges us to ask whose voices are being silenced today, what texts are being suppressed, what alternatives are being foreclosed by the exercise of institutional power. The Gospel of Thomas disappeared not because it lacked value or authenticity, not because it failed to speak to human spiritual experience, but because it threatened institutional power. Its absence shaped Christianity for 16 centuries. Its rediscovery changes everything. Upper Egypt in the 4th century was a landscape of extremes. The Nile Valley, a narrow ribbon of fertility, supported dense agricultural settlements. Immediately beyond the irrigated land lay the desert, vast and implacable. This stark boundary between life and death, between the known world and the wilderness, had profound religious significance. The Egyptian desert became central to Christian monasticism. Beginning in the 3rd century, men and women retreated to the desert seeking holiness, escaping persecution, or rejecting the compromises of urban Christianity. These desert fathers and mothers, Anthony, Pachomius, Macrina, Mary of Egypt, became legendary figures, models of ascetic discipline and spiritual power. Pachomius, who lived from approximately 292 to 348 CE, founded the first Cenobitic monasteries in Upper Egypt. Unlike earlier hermit monks who lived in isolation, Pachomian monks lived in organized communities with common rules, shared work, and communal worship. By the time of Pachomius's death, 9 monasteries for men and 2 for women had been established in the Thebait, the region of Upper Egypt where the Nag Hammadi codices would eventually be discovered. These monasteries were not merely spiritual retreats, they were economic enterprises, agricultural centres that cultivated land, produced goods, and participated in local and regional trade. They were also intellectual centres. Monasteries needed books for liturgy, biblical study, and spiritual formation. They established scriptoria where monks copied texts. They accumulated libraries. The relationship between monasteries and episcopal authority was complex. Bishops claimed jurisdiction over monasteries in their territories and expected obedience. Monastics sometimes resisted, claiming that their direct relationship with God superseded episcopal authority. This tension created space for theological diversity within monasticism, even as bishops worked to enforce orthodoxy. The libraries of Pachomian monasteries reflected this complexity. They certainly contained canonical scriptures, liturgical texts, and writings of approved church fathers, but they also contained older texts from earlier, more diverse periods of Christianity. Monks copied texts they found valuable for spiritual formation, texts that helped them understand scripture, texts that challenged them to deeper contemplation. Some of these texts were increasingly problematic from an episcopal perspective. As canon lists stabilized and boundaries around orthodoxy hardened, texts that had once been widely read became suspicious. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, texts attributed to Valentinus and other 2nd century teachers, these were now officially heretical. But monasteries that had possessed them for generations did not immediately destroy them. Athanasius's Easter letter of 367 CE forced the issue. Writing to churches and monasteries under his authority as Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius listed the 27 books of the New Testament and declared that these alone were canonical. He explicitly forbade the reading of apocryphal books, which he described as inventions of heretics. This was not merely a suggestion, but a command backed by episcopal authority. Athanasius expected compliance. Monasteries were to review their libraries, remove heretical texts, and conform to the canonical list. Resistance would result in consequences: loss of episcopal support, excommunication, potential confiscation of property. Some monasteries complied fully, destroying their non-canonical texts. Others complied outwardly while preserving texts they valued. Still others actively resisted, hiding their libraries or smuggling texts to safer locations. The Nag Hammadi codices represent one such act of resistance and preservation. The codices themselves provide clues about their origin and purpose. They are professionally produced books, not crude amateur work. The papyrus is good quality, the Coptic script is clear and practiced, the leather binding is skillfully done. This was expensive work requiring trained scribes and significant resources. These were not personal notebooks, but library volumes intended for communal use. The contents of the 13 codices reveal a deliberate collection. There are 52 separate texts, many of them substantial works. They include Gospels, Apocalypses, Acts, letters, and philosophical treatises. Some texts appear in multiple codices, suggesting the collection was assembled over time from various sources. The texts are predominantly associated with what church fathers called Gnosticism, emphasizing knowledge, revelation, and inner transformation. But the collection also includes works not typically classified as Gnostic. The Gospel of Thomas, while containing some Gnostic-like sayings, is not a full-fledged Gnostic text. A fragment of Plato's Republic appears in Codex 6, suggesting broader philosophical interests. The collection represents not a narrow sectarian library, but a diverse compilation of texts valued for various reasons. Dating the codices is complex. Paleographic analysis, study of handwriting styles, suggests the manuscripts were copied in the mid to late 4th century, probably between 350 and 400 CE. This timing is significant. It coincides precisely with the period of greatest pressure to conform to orthodox standards, the period when Athanasius was enforcing his canonical list and heretical texts were being systematically destroyed. The physical construction of the codices provides additional information. The leather covers were made from reused materials. Chemical analysis and examination have revealed that some covers were constructed from discarded leather, including one cover that appears to have been made from a recycled liturgical book. This suggests either poverty or haste in the binding process, or possibly both. Inside some of the covers, recycled papyrus was used as padding. These fragments include portions of letters, business documents, and other texts that can be dated. One fragment contains a date equivalent to 348 CE. This provides a terminus post quem. The codices could not have been bound before this date. Combined with paleographic analysis, this suggests the codices were produced in the latter half of the 4th century. The question of who created and owned this library remains partially open. The most widely accepted theory is that the codices belong to a Pachomian monastery in the area, possibly the monastery of St. Pachomius at Chenoboskion, modern Qasr es-Sayyid, about 6 kilometers from where the codices were discovered. This monastery was one of the original foundations and would have had the resources and scribal expertise to produce such a collection. But why would an Orthodox Pachomian monastery possess and preserve heretical texts? Several explanations are possible. First, the texts may have been inherited from an earlier period when such materials were acceptable. Monasteries often accumulated books over generations. Older texts remained in libraries even as theological standards changed. Second, monks may have valued these texts for spiritual formation despite their heretical classification. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, contains wisdom that could be read devotionally without necessarily accepting its theological framework. Monks seeking to understand Jesus' teachings might study multiple sources, even problematic ones. Third, the monastery may have included monks with sympathies for alternative theologies. Monasticism attracted people dissatisfied with conventional Christianity. Some monks may have actively appreciated the Gnostic emphasis on knowledge and inner transformation, seeing it as compatible with monastic spirituality of contemplation and ascetic discipline. Fourth, intellectual curiosity may have motivated preservation. Monks engaged in theological education and debate needed to know what various groups taught, including heretics. Keeping heretical texts for study purposes could be justified even as one rejected their teachings. Whatever the motivation, someone decided that when Athanasius's directive required removal of heretical texts, these particular books should not be destroyed but preserved. This required planning and risk. The codices had to be removed from the monastery without arousing suspicion, transported to a hiding place and concealed effectively. The location chosen was near Jabal al-Tarif, a limestone cliff riddled with caves that had served as burial grounds since ancient times. The area was known to local people but not constantly monitored. The caves offered protection from weather and natural hiding places. It was close enough to the monastery for accessibility, but remote enough for concealment. The codices were placed in a large earthenware jar, approximately 2 feet tall, with a bowl serving as a lid. This was sealed, perhaps with resin or wax, to protect the contents from moisture and insects. The jar was then buried or placed in a cave, concealed from view but potentially recoverable. This act represents a remarkable statement of faith. Whoever hid these books believed they contained valuable truth worth preserving, even at personal risk. They must have hoped that someday circumstances would change, that the persecution would end, that the text could be recovered and returned to use. They were burying not just books but a vision of Christianity, a way of understanding Jesus that was being systematically erased. The Egyptian desert had become a vault, a place where suppressed knowledge could survive. This was not unique to the Nag Hammadi codices. The dry climate of Egypt has preserved countless texts that would have deteriorated elsewhere. The Oxyrhynchus papyri discovered beginning in 1897 include thousands of fragments of literary, documentary, and religious texts, including the 3 Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 47 in caves near the Dead Sea, preserved Jewish texts hidden 2,000 years ago. In each case, the desert served as preserver. The absence of moisture meant papyrus and parchment did not rot. The aridity and isolation meant texts remained undisturbed for centuries. The desert that symbolized death and wilderness also became the medium of survival, the place where suppressed voices could wait in silence for rediscovery. The landscape around Jabal al-Tarif would have been stark and beautiful. The limestone cliffs glowed white and gold in the desert sun. The Nile Valley was visible in the distance, a green stripe of life against the brown wasteland. The silence would have been profound, broken only by wind and the occasional call of birds. It was a liminal space, neither fully in the world nor fully withdrawn from it, a fitting location for texts that represented a marginalized Christianity. For the monks or individuals who buried the codices, this act of concealment was an act of hope. They could not know that it would be 1600 years before the texts were rediscovered. They probably hoped for recovery within their own lifetimes, or at least within a generation or two. But even if they suspected the persecution would last longer, they chose preservation over destruction. They refused to be complicit in the erasure of these texts and the traditions they represented. The desert vault held its secrets. Years became decades, decades became centuries. The monastery that likely owned the codices eventually ceased to exist. The memory of the buried texts faded. The location was forgotten. The jar sat undisturbed through the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, colonialism, world wars. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, religions evolved, and still the jar remained sealed, the text silent. The desert is patient. It preserves what is given to it without judgment, without preference. It held the Gospel of Thomas as carefully as it held the bones of ancient Egyptians buried in the same cliffs. It made no distinction between orthodox and heretic, between accepted and suppressed. In the neutrality of the desert, the Gospel of Thomas waited, neither alive nor dead, neither present nor absent, suspended in possibility. The person or persons who buried those texts could not have imagined the world that would eventually discover them. They could not have foreseen that the institutional church would lose its monopoly on scriptural interpretation, that historical criticism would develop as an academic discipline, that religious diversity would become acceptable in many societies, that the texts they hid would become objects of intense scholarly interest and popular fascination. They could only do what they believed was right: save these texts from destruction, preserve them against an uncertain future, trust that truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful institutions try to suppress it. In that act of trust, they gave a gift to future generations, a gift that would not be open for 16 centuries, but which, once opened, would change how we understand Christian origins and the diversity of early Christian thought. The desert as vault is a powerful metaphor for all the lost knowledge, suppressed traditions, and marginalized voices that might yet be recovered. How many other texts lie buried waiting for discovery? How many other traditions were suppressed so thoroughly that no physical trace remains? How much of early Christian diversity has been lost forever because no one thought to hide the evidence? The Nag Hammadi discovery reminds us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For centuries, scholars knew about the Gospel of Thomas only through hostile references in church fathers. They had no idea what it actually said. Its discovery proved that texts can survive against all odds, that the desert can preserve what human institutions try to destroy, that suppressed voices can speak again, even after millennia of silence. December 1945. The Second World War had just ended. Europe lay in ruins. The atomic age had begun with the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world was being remade. In this moment of global transformation, a discovery was made in Upper Egypt that would transform our understanding of early Christianity. Muhammad Ali al-Saman and his brothers were digging for sabach, a soft soil rich in nitrates used as fertilizer near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in the Nag Hammadi region. This was manual labour, the kind of work rural Egyptians had been doing for millennia, unremarkable and repetitive. The brothers were looking for sabach to sell to farmers. They were not looking for ancient manuscripts. Muhammad Ali's mattock struck something solid. Clearing away the soil, the brothers uncovered a large sealed jar, approximately 2 feet tall, made of red earthenware. The jar was intact, its bowl-shaped lid sealed in place. This was unusual. Such jars sometimes contained treasure, gold, jewellery, valuable objects buried for safekeeping. But they also sometimes contained jinn, evil spirits that would curse anyone who opened them. The brothers hesitated. Superstition warred with hope of treasure. Finally, avarice won. Muhammad Ali struck the jar with his mattock, breaking it open. Instead of gold or jinn, papyrus manuscripts spilled out. The brothers were disappointed. Old books had no obvious value. They could not be sold easily, could not be eaten, could not be used as fuel. The brothers gathered up the codices, 13 leather-bound books, and took them home, uncertain what to do with them. What happened next is complex and somewhat disputed. The various accounts from participants and witnesses do not entirely agree, but the general outline is clear. The codices passed through multiple hands, were broken up and dispersed, were bought and sold, were exported legally and illegally, and eventually, after years of complicated negotiations, came to rest in the Coptic Museum in Cairo and other institutions. Muhammad Ali's mother, according to some accounts, used some pages as kindling for her oven, unaware that she was burning texts nearly 2,000 years old. Other pages were given away or sold to neighbours. At least one complete codex was acquired by a local history teacher. Word spread that ancient books had been found and dealers began making inquiries. The antiquities market in Egypt was well established and largely illegal. Archaeological sites were regularly looted and objects were smuggled out of the country to sell to wealthy collectors and museums in Europe and America. The Nag Hammadi codices entered this shadowy economy. One codex was acquired by a Cypriot antiquities dealer who attempted to sell it in Cairo. Through a complicated chain of events, it came to the attention of Jean Dorès, a French scholar studying Coptic texts in Egypt. Dorès immediately recognized the significance of what he was seeing. These were not ordinary manuscripts, but potentially revolutionary texts from early Christianity. Dorès contacted the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, which began efforts to recover the codices. This was complicated by the fact that they had already been dispersed. Some remained with the Al-Saman family or their neighbours, some had been sold to dealers. One codex had already left Egypt and would eventually end up in Switzerland. The Egyptian government, led by the Department of Antiquities, worked to gather the codices. Legal pressure was applied to dealers and collectors. The Coptic Museum in Cairo, under the direction of Pahor Labib, became the central repository. By 1946, most of the codices had been recovered and were in the museum's possession. But one codex, later designated Codex I, had been smuggled out of Egypt and sold to the Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland. It was purchased on behalf of the institute by a dealer who recognized its value. The Jung Institute acquired it partly as an honor to Carl Gustav Jung, the famous psychologist who had extensive interests in religion and mythology. The codex became known as the Jung Codex. This created diplomatic and scholarly complications. Egypt wanted all the codices returned. The Jung Institute argued it had purchased the codex legally on the international market and had no obligation to return it. Scholarly politics became entangled with national pride and international antiquities law. Meanwhile, scholars who had seen the codices recognized their extraordinary significance. These were not just any ancient Christian texts, but texts from traditions that had been suppressed and were known only through hostile descriptions by church fathers. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, texts mentioned in ancient sources, but never before seen in full. The codices had to be carefully conserved before they could be properly studied. 1,600 years in the desert had left them fragile. The leather covers were dried and cracked. The papyrus pages were brittle. The bindings had deteriorated. Professional conservators worked slowly to stabilize the manuscripts, separate pages that had stuck together, and prepare them for photography and study. photographing the codices was itself a major undertaking. This was before digital photography, before computers. Each page had to be carefully positioned, lit, and photographed on film. The resulting photographs would become the basis for scholarly study, distributed to researchers around the world while the fragile originals remained protected in the museum. The first publications appeared in the 1950s. The Young Codex was published first because it was in Switzerland and more readily accessible to Western scholars. The Gospel of Truth appeared in 1956. The Gospel of Thomas was published in 1959 by Antoine Guillemont, Henri Charles Puech, Gilles Quispel, Walter Till, and Yasser Abd al-Masih. This publication was a sensation. Scholars and general readers alike were stunned. Here was a gospel attributed to Thomas containing sayings of Jesus that were not in the canonical Gospels. Some sayings closely paralleled canonical material, but many were entirely new. The text claimed to contain secret sayings. It emphasized knowledge as the path to salvation. It presented a Jesus who was primarily a wisdom teacher, not a sacrificial victim or apocalyptic prophet. The scholarly response was immediate and divided. Some scholars argued that the Gospel of Thomas was early and independent, potentially preserving authentic sayings of Jesus. Others argued it was late and derivative, composed in the 2nd century by Gnostic Christians drawing on the canonical Gospels. The debate continues to this day. Popular response was equally varied. For some, the Gospel of Thomas represented a revelation, an alternative vision of Christianity that resonated with modern spiritual seekers. For others, it was a dangerous heresy, an attempt to undermine Orthodox faith. Conservative Christian leaders denounced the text, warning believers not to be deceived by the ancient heresies resurrected in modern times. The complete publication of all the Nag Hammadi codices took decades. Political instability in Egypt, scholarly disputes over access and publication rights, the sheer volume of material, and the technical challenges of working with fragmentary ancient manuscripts all contributed to delays. The facsimile edition, photographic reproductions of all the pages, was finally completed in 1977. English translations of all the texts appeared in 1970 in the Nag Hammadi Library in English, edited by James M. Robinson. These publications transformed the study of early Christianity. Suddenly, scholars had access to texts from Christian groups that had previously been known only through the hostile accounts of their opponents. The diversity of early Christianity, which scholars had suspected from fragmentary evidence, was now abundantly documented. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and dozens of other texts reveal the richness and complexity of Christian thought in the first centuries. The discovery also raised profound questions about orthodoxy and heresy. If these alternative Christianities were as ancient as the Orthodox tradition, if their texts were as old as the canonical Gospels, on what basis had they been labelled heretical? The traditional answer, that they were later corruptions of original apostolic teaching, was no longer tenable. The alternatives were original, not derivative. The Nag Hammadi discovery came at a crucial moment in the history of biblical scholarship. The mid-20th century saw the development of new historical methods for studying ancient texts, the rise of religious studies as an academic discipline distinct from theology, and growing interest in comparative religion and mysticism. The Gospel of Thomas and related texts fit this intellectual moment perfectly. Scholars like Elaine Pagels, whose book The Gnostic Gospels became a bestseller in 1879, brought the Nag Hammadi texts to a general audience. Pagels argued that the suppression of Gnostic Christianity was not about truth versus error, but about power. The institutional church marginalized alternatives to consolidate its authority. The Gospel of Thomas represented a road not taken, a form of Christianity that emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional control. This interpretation was controversial. Orthodox Christian scholars argued that Pagels and others were romanticizing Gnosticism, ignoring its problematic features, and imposing modern categories on ancient texts. The debate over how to interpret the Nag Hammadi texts became part of larger culture wars about the nature of Christianity, the role of religious institutions, and the relationship between spirituality and orthodoxy. The physical codices themselves remain in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they are carefully preserved in climate-controlled conditions. Only a few scholars have direct access. Most study the photographs and printed editions. The Jung Codex was eventually returned to Egypt in 1975, reuniting the collection after decades of separation. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices was accidental, like most major archaeological discoveries. Muhammad Ali and his brothers were not searching for ancient manuscripts, they were digging for fertilizer. That they happened to strike the jar, that they chose to break it open despite superstitious fears, that the codices survived their initial rough handling, all of this was chance. But chance operates within historical contexts. If the codices had been discovered a century earlier, they would likely have been less well preserved, less carefully studied, and less widely disseminated. If they had been discovered a century later, who knows if they would have survived? The timing of the discovery, in the mid-20th century, meant the texts entered a world prepared to receive them, a scholarly community with the tools to study them, and a cultural moment hungry for alternatives to conventional religion. The discovery also depended on the dedication of particular individuals. Jean Jaurès recognized the significance of what he saw and worked to preserve it. Pahor Labib at the Coptic Museum fought to recover the scattered codices and protect them. James M. Robinson coordinated the international scholarly effort to publish the texts. Countless conservators, photographers, translators, and scholars contributed their expertise. Without this collective effort, the discovery might have amounted to nothing. The codices scattered or destroyed, their contents lost again. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Thomas after 1600 years of cadence is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of archaeology and religious studies. A text suppressed by institutional power, buried in the desert, forgotten for millennia, suddenly speaking again to a world transformed beyond recognition. The farmer's mattock that struck the jar broke more than earthenware. It fractured the orthodox narrative of Christian origins, revealing fractures that had been carefully concealed for centuries. The Gospel of Thomas does not yield its meaning easily. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which provide narrative context for Jesus' teachings, Thomas presents bare sayings without explanation. The reader is left to interpret, to search for connections, to discover hidden meanings. This was intentional. The text begins with a promise and a challenge. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Modern scholarship has brought multiple methodologies to bear on the Gospel of Thomas: linguistic analysis, historical criticism, comparative religion, literary theory, and theological interpretation. Each approach reveals different dimensions of the text. Linguistic analysis begins with the fact that the complete text we possess is in Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. Coptic was written using Greek letters supplemented with additional characters for sounds not present in Greek. It was the native language of Egypt in late antiquity, used by both Christians and the diminishing population of traditional Egyptian religion adherents. The Coptic text is clearly a translation. The syntax sometimes feels awkward, as though the translator was working from a Greek source and trying to render it literally. Certain phrases use Greek loanwords rather than native Coptic terms, suggesting the translator retained some Greek vocabulary when no exact Coptic equivalent existed. The 3 Greek fragments from Oxyrhynchus confirm that a Greek version of the Gospel of Thomas circulated in Egypt by around 200 CE. These fragments, designated P. Oxy 1, 654, and 655, contain runs of sayings that correspond to material in the Coptic version, though with variations in wording. Comparing the Greek fragments with the Coptic text reveals the kinds of changes that occurred in transmission: minor variations in word order, alternative vocabulary choices, occasional additions or omissions. But was Greek the original language? Scholars have identified Semitic idioms and patterns in the sayings that suggest an underlying Aramaic source. Word plays that work in Aramaic but not in Greek appear in several sayings. The paratactic structure, short clauses strung together with simple conjunctions, reflect Semitic rather than Greek style. This suggests that at least some sayings originated in Aramaic, Jesus' native language, and were translated first into Greek and then into Coptic. The textual history of the Gospel of Thomas is thus multi-layered: oral Aramaic traditions, written Aramaic collection, Greek translation, Coptic translation. Each stage involved not just linguistic conversion, but interpretation. Translators made choices about how to render ambiguous phrases, how to structure sentences, which connotations to emphasize. The text we have is the product of this complex history. Historical criticism examines the Gospel of Thomas in relation to other early Christian texts, particularly the canonical Gospels and hypothetical Q source. Approximately half the sayings in Thomas have parallels in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. The question is, what is the relationship? Three main positions have emerged. The first argues that Thomas is early and independent, drawing on oral traditions and possibly written sources that the canonical evangelists also used. This position emphasizes the shorter, simpler forms of many sayings in Thomas, arguing that simplicity suggests priority. The second position argues that Thomas is late and dependent, composed in the 2nd century by someone who knew the canonical Gospels and selected and adapted material for Gnostic purposes. This position emphasizes Thomas's distinctive theological themes that align with 2nd century Gnosticism. The third position is mediating, suggesting Thomas contains layers from different periods, an early core of independent tradition overlaid with later editorial additions. The relationship to Q is particularly intriguing. Q, the hypothetical saying source used by Matthew and Luke, was also a collection of Jesus' teachings without narrative framework. The very existence of Q demonstrates that sayings Gospels were a recognized genre in early Christianity. Thomas and Q may represent parallel developments, different communities collecting and preserving Jesus' sayings in different ways for different purposes. Some scholars have proposed direct relationships. Perhaps Thomas drew on Q, or Q drew on Thomas, or both drew on a common or earlier source. Others argue for independence, suggesting that multiple sayings collections circulated in the 1st century and Thomas represents one strand while Q represents another. Comparative analysis reveals how Thomas handles material that appears in canonical Gospels. Often, Thomas's version is shorter and lacks allegorical interpretation. For example, Thomas saying 65 tells the parable of the wicked tenants who kill the vineyard owner's servants and son. In the synoptic versions, Mark 12:1-12, Matthew 21:33-46, Luke 20:9-19, the parable is explicitly allegorical. The vineyard is Israel, the owner is God, the servants are prophets, the son is Jesus, and the tenant's punishment represents judgment on Israel. Thomas tells the story without this interpretive framework, leaving the reader to determine its meaning. This pattern, Thomas preserving simpler forms while canonical Gospels provide interpretive expansion, appears repeatedly. Scholars debate its significance. Does simplicity indicate earliness, or does it reflect Thomas's deliberate stripping away of narrative context to focus on hidden meanings? Thomas also contains many sayings with no canonical parallels. These are the most intriguing because they potentially represent independent Jesus tradition not preserved in the canonical Gospels. Saying 7 declares, "It is I who am the light which is above them all. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. This saying expresses panentheism, God's presence in all things, using language that resonates with both Jewish wisdom literature and Hellenistic philosophy. It has no parallel in the canonical tradition. Is it an authentic saying of Jesus, perhaps preserved only in Thomasine tradition? Or is it a 2nd century composition reflecting developed Christology and philosophical influence? Scholars disagree. Saying 114, the controversial saying about Mary needing to become male, has no canonical parallel. It appears to record an actual dispute within the community between those who wanted to exclude women, represented by Peter, and those who defended women's participation, represented by Jesus, though using patriarchal language. This could reflect 1st century conflicts over women's roles, or it could reflect 2nd century debates in communities using the Gospel of Thomas. Literary analysis examines the structure and rhetoric of the text. Although Thomas appears to be a random collection of sayings, scholars have detected organizing principles. Catchword connections link some sayings. A word in one saying triggers the next saying that uses the same or a related word. Thematic groupings cluster sayings about similar topics. Rhetorical patterns create emphasis and progression. The text opens programmatically with a promise that discovering interpretation brings life. It closes problematically with the Mary saying, creating tension and inviting continued reflection. The placement of sayings is not random but represents editorial choices designed to guide readers through interpretive challenges. The literary genre of Thomas is distinctive. It is neither a narrative gospel like Mark, nor a discourse gospel like John, nor a purely ethical manual like the Didache. It is a sayings collection that invites and requires interpretation, a text that withholds as much as it reveals, that frustrates attempts at simple understanding. This literary strategy serves its theological purpose. Salvation comes through discovery, through personal insight, through the hard work of interpretation. Theological interpretation focuses on the distinctive themes that permeate the Gospel of Thomas. The realized eschatology, the kingdom as present reality, appears in multiple sayings. Saying 3, if those who lead you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. This saying rejects future apocalyptic expectations in favor of present recognition. The kingdom is not coming. It is already here. The problem is not its absence, but human blindness. This theological position has profound implications for ethics, community organization, and religious practice. The emphasis on knowledge as salvific appears throughout. Saying 67, if one who knows the all still feels a personal deficiency, he is completely deficient. True knowledge is not intellectual information, but transformative realization of one's unity with the divine all. This gnosis transcends ordinary knowing and becomes a mode of being. The ambivalent relationship to the material world creates interpretive challenges. Some sayings seem to denigrate the body and physical existence. Wretched is the body that is dependent upon a body. Others affirm divine presence in material reality. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. This tension has led to debates about whether Thomas is fundamentally Gnostic, viewing matter as evil or inferior, or whether it holds a more complex position that transcends simple dualism. The role of Jesus in Thomas is distinctive. He is primarily a wisdom teacher, a revealer of hidden truths, rather than a sacrificial saviour or apocalyptic prophet. His authority comes not from his death and resurrection, but from his knowledge of divine mysteries. This Jesus is closer to the figure in the Gospel of John's prologue, the divine Logos through whom all things were made, than to the Jesus of the synoptic passion, narratives. Understanding Thomas requires attending to its intertextual relationships with Jewish scripture and tradition. Many sayings draw on prophetic texts, wisdom literature, and apocalyptic imagery. The parable forms reflect Jesus' Jewish context. The emphasis on knowing God resonates with Jeremiah's new covenant. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me. Jeremiah 31:34. The text also engages Hellenistic philosophy, particularly Stoic concepts of the divine logos pervading all things, and Platonic ideas about the soul's relationship to transcendent reality. Whether this philosophical influence came from Jesus himself, possible given the Hellenistic culture of first-century Galilee, or from later editors and translators, probable given Thomas's likely textual history, remains debated. Decoding the Gospel of Thomas is not a task that can be completed definitively. New interpretations emerge as scholars bring new questions and methods to the text. Feminist readers examine gender dynamics. Post-colonial scholars explore power relations. Psychologists analyze the text's mystical dimensions. Each approach reveals something previously hidden, demonstrating that the text's invitation to discover hidden meanings is inexhaustible. The Gospel of Thomas resists final interpretation, and this resistance is part of its message. Truth is not a fixed proposition to be memorized, but a reality to be discovered through ongoing engagement. The text does not provide answers, but poses questions. It does not close inquiry, but opens it. In this sense, the Gospel of Thomas practices what it preaches. It makes readers seekers, demanding active interpretation rather than passive reception. At the heart of the Gospel of Thomas lies a revolutionary theological vision. The kingdom of God is not a future event, but a present reality. Not an external location, but an internal truth. Not something to be achieved through correct behavior, but something to be discovered through self-knowledge. This teaching, articulated across multiple sayings, represents perhaps the most radical departure from canonical Christianity. Saying 3 articulates this vision clearly. If those who lead you say to you, See, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, It is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. The logic is devastating. If the kingdom is in the sky or the sea, anywhere external to human beings, then birds and fish have better access to it than humans do. The very absurdity of this image undermines any externalized understanding of the kingdom. Instead, the kingdom is simultaneously inside and outside, immanent and transcendent, already present but requiring recognition. The key to recognizing the kingdom is self-knowledge. Knowledge. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known. This is not introspection in the modern psychological sense, but a deeper ontological recognition. Discovering that one's true identity is not separate from God, but participatory in divine being. To know oneself truly is to realize, it is you who are the sons of the living Father. The consequence of failing to achieve this self-knowledge is not punishment in hell, or exclusion from a future reward, but present poverty. Those who do not know themselves dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty. The poverty is not real but existential, a fundamental alienation from one's own true nature and from the divine ground of being. This teaching has roots in Jewish tradition. The prophets spoke of knowing God in terms of intimate relationship rather than external observation. Jeremiah 31 promises a new covenant in which knowledge of God will be internal. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. The wisdom literature of Judaism personified wisdom as a feminine divine attribute present at creation, available to those who seek her, offering life and blessing. Proverbs 8 has wisdom declare, "The Lord created me at the beginning of his work. When he established the heavens, I was there. Then I was beside him, like a master worker." The Gospel of Thomas draws on this wisdom tradition but radicalizes it. Wisdom is not something external to be sought, but something internal to be recognized. The divine light that illuminates the world is already present within each person. Saying 24, "There is light within a man of light, and it lights up the whole world. If he does not shine, he is darkness." This internal light is not metaphorical but ontological. Human beings are not merely created by God or separated from God by sin. They carry divine light within themselves. The task is not to be saved from sin by external intervention, but to recognize and manifest the light that is already present. Saying 7 makes this even more explicit. "It is I who am the light which is above them all. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This saying presents Jesus speaking as the divine Logos, the principle through which all things exist. But the final lines, "split a piece of wood, lift up the stone," suggest that this divine presence is not remote but immediately accessible in the ordinary physical world. The sacred is not separate from the profane but pervades it. Every material object contains or manifests divine presence. This panentheistic vision, God in all things but not identical with all things, has parallels in both Jewish and Greek thought. Stoic philosophy spoke of the divine Logos as the rational principle organizing and pervading the cosmos. Jewish mystical tradition spoke of the Shekinah, God's presence dwelling with the people. But Thomas's formulation is distinctive in its emphasis on immediate accessibility and internal recognition. The realized eschatology of Thomas directly challenges apocalyptic Christianity. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus preaches the imminent coming of the kingdom. Mark 1:15, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near." Matthew and Luke preserve sayings about the Son of Man coming in glory, about the righteous being rewarded and the wicked punished, about a future cosmic transformation. Paul expected Jesus to return within his lifetime. We who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. 1 Thessalonians 4:15. When this did not happen, later Christians developed theologies to explain the delay. The kingdom's coming was postponed, perhaps indefinitely. Believers must wait faithfully, enduring present suffering and hope of future reward. Thomas rejects this entire framework, saying 113, "His disciples said to him, 'When will the kingdom come?' Jesus said to them, 'It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and men do not see it." The kingdom has already come. It is spread out upon the earth right now. The problem is not that God has delayed the kingdom's arrival, but that human beings fail to perceive its presence. This shifts the entire soteriological focus from future hope to present recognition, from passive waiting to active seeing. This theological move has profound practical implications. If salvation is future, then endurance and obedience in the present are required. Institutional structures that mediate between God and humanity, priests, sacraments, churches, are necessary to maintain believers in a state of grace until the future reward. Ethics becomes about following rules and avoiding sin to ensure future salvation. But if salvation is present recognition, then the entire institutional apparatus becomes unnecessary. No mediator is needed between the individual and the God who is already present within and throughout reality. Ethics becomes not about following external rules, but about living in accordance with one's recognized divine nature. Community exists not to mediate salvation, but to support mutual awakening. The Gospel of Thomas's teaching about the light within connects to its emphasis on seeing and vision. Saying 5, recognize what is in your sight, and that which is hidden from you will become plain to you, for there is nothing hidden which will not become manifest. The hidden and the manifest are not different realities, but different modes of seeing. That which is hidden from ordinary sight becomes plain to those who see truly. This is not about acquiring new information, but about transforming perception. The awakened person sees the same world as everyone else, but sees it truly, recognizing the divine presence that pervades it. This connects to ancient traditions of spiritual practice aimed at transforming consciousness. Jewish mysticism developed techniques of meditation on divine names, contemplation of the divine chariot described in Ezekiel, and visionary ascent through heavenly realms. Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism, taught that the philosopher must turn away from the world of appearances to perceive eternal realities. The Gospel of Thomas does not provide detailed instructions for such practice, but its emphasis on seeking, finding, and being transformed suggests a process of spiritual development. Saying 2, let him who seeks continue, seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over all. This saying describes a journey: seeking, finding, trouble, astonishment, ruling. The seeker experiences not immediate peace, but initial disturbance. The discovery of hidden truth is troubling because it overturns conventional understanding, challenges comfortable assumptions, demands transformation. But beyond the trouble lies astonishment, a state of wonder and recognition. And beyond astonishment lies ruling, not domination over others, but mastery of oneself, freedom from ignorance and delusion. The connection between self-knowledge and knowledge of God is fundamental to Thomas's theology. These are not two different kinds of knowledge, but one. To know oneself truly is to know God, and to know God truly is to know oneself. This unity of self and God is not pantheistic identification, claiming that the individual ego is God, but recognition of participation in divine being. Saying 108, whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become he, and the things that are hidden will be revealed to him. The disciple becomes like Jesus, and Jesus becomes the disciple. This mutual indwelling suggests a mystical union in which separateness is transcended without individual identity being annihilated. This mystical dimension of Thomasine theology has analogues in many religious traditions. Hindu Vedanta teaches Tattvamasi, you are that, identifying the individual self, Atman, with ultimate reality, Brahman. Buddhist teachings about Buddha nature suggest that all beings possess the potential for enlightenment. Sufi Islam speaks of Fana, annihilation of the ego, and Baka, subsistence in God. Christian mysticism from Meister Eckhart to Teresa of Avila describes union with God that transcends ordinary consciousness. The Gospel of Thomas can be read as an early Christian mystical text, a guide to contemplative practice aimed at direct experience of divine presence. The sayings function not as doctrinal propositions to be believed, but as contemplative objects to be meditated upon. Their obscurity is intentional, designed to frustrate ordinary understanding and provoke deeper inquiry. This mystical reading has been both celebrated and contested. Scholars sympathetic to mysticism see Thomas as preserving an authentic dimension of Jesus' teaching that was suppressed by institutional Christianity's emphasis on external authority and future salvation. Critics argue that this reading projects modern mystical interests onto an ancient text that may have meant something quite different in its original context. The relationship between Thomas's inner kingdom and ethics is complex. If salvation is internal recognition rather than external behavior, does ethics become irrelevant? Some sayings suggest that conventional religious practices are unnecessary or even harmful. Saying 14, "If you fast, you will give rise to sin for yourselves, and if you pray, you will be condemned, and if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits." This appears to reject traditional Jewish piety, fasting, prayer, and almsgiving, but the rejection may be of the practices when done mechanically, without inner transformation. Or the saying may reflect Thomas's general skepticism toward external religious observance as a path to salvation. The text does not develop a systematic ethics, leaving interpreters to debate whether it represents ethical indifference, ethical transcendence, or simply a different ethical foundation. The inner kingdom theology of Thomas represents one of early Christianity's roads not taken. Had this vision been preserved alongside apocalyptic and institutional forms of Christianity, the tradition would have maintained a vital mystical dimension. Seekers dissatisfied with external religion could have found scriptural support for contemplative practice. The tension between inner and outer, between recognition and obedience, between present realization and future hope, would have enriched Christian thought. Instead, this vision was suppressed, the Gospel of Thomas was buried, and Christianity developed primarily as a religion of external authority, sacramental mediation, and future salvation. The inner kingdom became marginalized, preserved only in mystical subcultures, often viewed suspiciously by institutional authorities. The rediscovery of Thomas allows us to see what was lost and to ask whether Christianity might yet recover this dimension of its origins.